Another model suggests that Columbia was one of the first supercontinents to exist around 1.8 billion years ago. The period of collision and orogeny that led to its formation began 2.2 billion years ago. Columbia included most of the Earth's landmass at the time. Its dimensions are estimated at around 12,900 kilometers, or 8,000 miles from north to south, and 4,800 kilometers, or 3,000 miles, at its widest point. Following its final assembly, Columbia underwent more than 1 billion years of growth in subduction zones, creating a huge magma accretion belt. Columbia began to fragment 1.6 billion years ago. Within a few million years, the continent disappeared completely, scattering its various fragments across the globe. 500 million years later, they would come together again to form the supercontinent Rodinia. Rodinia was a supercontinent that existed in the Proterozoic. It is the first well-documented supercontinent, being as recent as Columbia or Around 1.1 billion years ago, plate tectonics brought together several continental masses, resulting from the fragmentation of Columbia. Two continental blocks, the ancient parts of North and South America, collide to form a supercontinent called Rodinia. The Grenville Orogen, an immense mountain range stretching several thousand kilometers from present-day Quebec to Mexico, is the indelible trace of this continental weld. Rodinia encompasses almost every landmass of the time. It is surrounded by an ocean called Morovia. The Earth's appearance is very different from what we know today. The east coast of the United States adjoins the west coast of South America. Antarctica and Australia border the west coast of the USA. Far from the assembly zones, Rodinia consists of an enormous plain. More or less fine sands accumulate here. The supercontinent is totally barren, as life still exists only in water. At that time, the atmosphere contained only 5% of today's oxygen concentration. This was not enough to develop an ozone layer that protected the surface, and thus life forms from ultraviolet rays. Sediments from this period reveal numerous biological structures, such as stromatolites. At this time, life on Earth consisted mainly of single-celled life forms and microorganisms. These include bacteria and cyanobacteria. These are simple, often unicellular organisms. They are the precursors of the more complex life forms that will develop later. Environmental conditions on Earth at the time of Rodinia are different from those of today. Life was mainly microscopic. It would take hundreds of millions of years for more complex forms of life to evolve. At that time, we have to visualize the Earth as a single large continent surrounded by a vast ocean. The average temperature is 10.5 degrees Celsius, or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun's rays were not as powerful as they are today, so intensity was 6% lower. The day lasts less than 22 hours, and the year has 13 months. At the time of Rodinia, cells were already equipped with organelles that produce energy by ingesting and combining bacteria. Cyanobacteria capture light thanks to the presence of pigments. They can synthesize their own organic matter, mainly simple or complex sugars. We call them photosynthetic. More recently, cells have developed chloroplasts. This organelle enables them to capture the light that drives photosynthesis. Chloroplasts originate from the phenomenon of endosymbiosis. Cells with nuclei have ingested some of these photosynthetic bacteria. A number of changes then took place, including gene transfers between the host cell nucleus, the newly incorporated bacteria, and the elements already in place. The resulting cell is now self-sufficient. New types of organisms appear, such as chromophytes, haptophytes, dinoflagellates, and fungal spores. Organisms living on the supercontinent Rodinia experienced the advent of sexual reproduction. During this period, the acrotarchs remained. Most were unicellular green algae. They diversified greatly, reaching sizes ranging from 1/100th of a millimeter to several centimeters in diameter, and sporting round, smooth, polygonal, or spiky shapes. Multicellular algae with branched thallus also live alongside them. No animals live at this time. The continental waltz brings together and disperses continental masses around the globe every 400 to 600 million years or so. Supercontinents are like lids. Internal heat escapes only by conduction, a mechanism that is highly inefficient. It therefore accumulates, raising the temperature of the upper mantle and lower crust. The central parts of the continents heat up. The density of the rocks decreases, causing them to rise to the surface and form large domes. The crust stretches and thins. This movement creates fissures from which magma flows. Volcanic activity becomes very intense. Around 850 million years ago, a superdome formed in what is now the western United States. Within 100 million years, it began to crack and split. These cracks widen by a few centimeters every year, and the lava rises. Eventually, the crust ruptures, giving way to magma. An immense rift then separates Rodinia into two great masses. On one side are Australia, East Antarctica, and Southern Africa. On the other, Laurasia, South America, and West Africa. The Earth appears calm. The mid-ocean ripples are not very active, and the average temperature is falling. Immense expanses of ice take shape, extending to the edge of the equator. A feedback loop begins. Ice reflects more solar radiation than darker oceans. Cooling intensifies, and the entire planet freezes over, with temperatures dropping to minus 50 degrees Celsius or minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Ocean ice is over a kilometer thick. The Earth has been transformed into a veritable snowball. Ecosystems are in a state of upheaval, but at the very bottom of the oceans, bacteria and algae remain. The processes that enable the Earth to emerge from this snowball state are still poorly understood. Scientists speculate that volcanic carbon dioxide may have accumulated in two ways. Some of the CO2 may have accumulated in the atmosphere in quantities sufficient to cause the greenhouse effect to warm the planet. But the CO2 could also have accumulated under the ice and been released during an eruption. It would take 1 million years for the thick mantle of ice covering the planet to melt. Pannotia is a supercontinent formed during the Neoproterozoic era, around 600 million years ago. It was formed by the assembly of cratons from the various fragments of Rodinia. The Pannotia supercontinent is also known by other names, such as Gondwanaland, Vendine, and Pan-Africa. Following the particularly cold period that followed the fragmentation of Rodinia, the Earth saw some form of primitive life flourish. The climate becomes rather warm, around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Depending on the area, the climate changes from tropical to arid, with higher temperatures. The cyanobacteria that survived the Ice Age resume their photosynthesis process. They release huge quantities of oxygen. Life resumes with much greater intensity. The rapidly evolving fauna of the Ediacaran will colonize the waters surrounding the newly formed supercontinent. The air is changing, with consequences for ecosystems. Microbial fauna evolves and becomes more complex. From now on, they are no longer simple agglomerates of cells, but real animals. The supercontinent Pannotia was short-lived. It began to break up 560 million years ago. Several lithospheric megaplates were formed, including Laurentia, Baltica, Siberia, and the largest piece, Gondwana. Several oceans, including the Iapetus Ocean, intruded into these immense continental masses. Changes were taking place, with far-reaching consequences for living beings. Gondwana is a supercontinent formed during the late Precambrian and early Paleozoic eras. It included the lands that now form South America, Africa, Antarctica, India, Australia, and the Arabian Peninsula. During active phases of plate tectonics, a climate conducive to species diversification is created. Sea levels rise and the climate changes, leading to profound changes in ocean chemistry. As a result, metazoans and other trilobites underwent a sudden and intense expansion, known as the Cambrian explosion. The multiple oceanic openings led to a diversification of habitats conducive to the development of life. In just a few million years, the number of species exploded. This was a decisive period in the evolution of life on Earth. Most of today's major metazoan phyla appeared, along with a huge diversity of animal, plant, and bacterial species. One of the main characteristics of this fauna is the acquisition of hard tissues in the form of mineralized skeletons. These include brachiopods, mollusks, archaeocyaths, and arthropods. Today, many organisms, including microscopic ones, barely a few millimeters in size, have mineralized skeletons. They may form shells or simply fragments of organisms. This mineralization occurs at the same time as organisms begin to burrow. The appearance of this shell may respond to a need for protection, providing armor against predators. The chemical reactions necessary for this mineralization require a great deal of energy over a relatively short period of time. This quantity is only available once a certain oxygen concentration is reached in the atmosphere, which corresponds to a minimum of 10% of the current concentration. This threshold was reached 542 million years ago. The oldest animal known today appears, the sponge. This proto-animal has no nervous system, no vascular system, and even less of a digestive system. It is reduced to its simplest form. It simply filters the water around it to obtain the nutrients it needs. The first soft-bodied animals develop. They are still unable to move and remain on the ocean floor. Animal life took a major step forward. From microscopic in size, organisms began to grow. The general shapes of these animals are highly varied and distinctive. They don't resemble anything we know today, but rather are shaped like discs or fleecy bags. The first bilaterally symmetrical animals appear. An important feature differentiating them from the Ediacara fauna is that they possess both internal and external organs. In particular, they now have eyes, legs, a digestive system, antennae, and a mouth. A food chain developed, with some living creatures acting as prey and others as predators. In addition to microorganisms, trilobites living on the ocean floor form the bottom of the food chain. At the very top, Anomalocaris represents the super predator of the time. This animal is a now extinct genus of arthropods. It was the first animal known to have complete visual organs and the first predator in the history of life. A far cry from the harmless little creatures of earlier times, Anomalocaris is a sea monster. Just under a meter long, it has sharp bony plates in its mouth, enabling it to crush its prey. It has large visual organs, compound eyes. These are 2 to 3 centimeters or 1 inch long, rod-shaped, and have 16,000 facets. Although still blurred, their vision is sufficient to enable them to distinguish their prey. This represents a considerable evolutionary leap forward in the history of life. Anomalocaris has such an atypical morphology that paleontologists have only recently been able to paint a complete picture of it. For years, they thought that different parts of its body belonged to different animals. Although its eyes hold all our attention, the mouth of this fearsome predator raises many questions. It takes the form of a flattened ring and has long been mistaken for a jellyfish. Some describe it as a flying saucer topped with a slice of pineapple. Its teeth enable it to feed on hard-shelled prey. Anomalocaris's long, narrow body is covered by an exoskeleton. Its flexible legs enable it to bring food to its mouth. This excellent swimmer uses its 28 paired lateral fins and long V-shaped tail to move swiftly through the water. Anomalocaris rubs shoulders with other creatures, each more original than the last. Opabinia regalis is a curious little animal. It has 5 eyes, 2 pairs on the sides and 1 in the center. This soft-bodied arthropod can measure between 40 and 70 millimeters. Opabinia regalis has a long, flexible proboscis that enables it to feed by catching its prey in the sediment and bringing it to its mouth. It remains on the seabed, but is quite capable of swimming to follow its prey. Hallucigenia is another totally hallucinating animal. Its morphology is reminiscent of a worm. It measures between 0.5 and 3 centimeters, or 1 inch in length. It has an elongated head with 2 eyes on top. Robust lamellae surround its mouth. It also has small teeth. The animal seems to move on stilts with its 7 pairs of spines. Hallucigenia lives on the ocean floor and feeds by sucking water through its mouth. It belongs to a group that also includes arthropods, but the structure of its legs suggests that it is a close relative of onychophores, caterpillar-like segmented animals with non-articulated appendages. Hallucigenia comes into close contact with Nectocaris teryx, an extinct genus of cephalopods. This animal has a head with 2 eyes, 1 or 2 pairs of appendages, and a carapace at the back. Its elongated, slender form gives it a morphology as similar to a primitive fish as it is to an insect. Nectocaris teryx is a free swimmer and moves very quickly. Its large eyes at the front of its head suggest that it must have been a predator. Among all these creatures, the Pangea gracilens catches our attention. This species of glass or eel measures just a few centimeters. It's not its size that interests us, but rather the protodorsal spine that qualifies it as the first animal of the phylum Chordates. Some scientists even suggest that it was the precursor of vertebrates and therefore of mammals. Pangea gracilens has 2 small tentacles around its mouth and pairs of appendages below its head. It has blood vessels and myomeres, which are bundles of muscles. It is the presence of a neural tube and a cord, a cartilaginous structure, that have made it possible to define its belonging to the chordates. Pangea gracilens spends most of its time on the seabed, feeding on organic matter. "485 million years ago, Gondwana, located at equatorial latitudes, tended to move towards the South Pole. At that time, the supercontinent was partly covered by shallow seas. As it neared the pole, Gondwana saw its temperatures drop. It begins to be covered by glaciers. The climate gradually cooled, even as biodiversity expanded. Over millions of years, great glaciers formed in these shallow seas. Sea levels fall. This sudden change in temperature also coincided with a major mass extinction, with the disappearance of 60% of all marine invertebrates and 25% of all families. Oxygen levels were equivalent to 2% of today's atmosphere. The ocean, teeming with life, gave way to emptiness and calm. Ocean levels are lower, and shoals more numerous. Surviving organisms continue to grow and multiply. A wide variety of organisms flourish on the seabed. This is the period of the Great Ordovician Biodiversification event. This event is favored by a rapid diversification of plankton. The fauna that remains on the ocean floor can feed and continue to develop. Trilobites are still present, albeit in smaller numbers, as are crinoids and bivalve brachiopods. Alongside them, new species appear. Coral grows in abundance, forming coral reefs that grace the seabed. Resembling small flowering trees attached to rocks or the seabed, corals are actually small animals. They form colonies and build a common skeleton, which, depending on the species, becomes the foundation of a coral reef. When they were first discovered, corals were regarded as marine plants that turned to stone once they were out of the water. It wasn't until the 18th century that coral was recognized as a member of the large Cnidaria family. Coral reefs form a veritable ecosystem. It's a very special natural environment made up of a variety of plants and animals. They are home to thousands of species of fish and other animals, such as shellfish, starfish, etc. Corals greatly enrich the marine fauna. We now return to our little Pangea, an animal just a few centimeters long with a protospine, which was probably one of the first vertebrates. Pangea's spine runs the entire length of the animal. It supports the muscles and organs that make up the animal. However, this cord is not made of bone, but of cartilage. Some fish will retain this feature, as is the case with the cartilaginous fish still found today. The best known of these are rays, sharks, and sawfish. But the Pangea we mentioned in the previous section has evolved. It no longer feeds via its gills. These are now used only for breathing. To feed, it sucks up its food, which consists of small invertebrates and the debris of dead animals left on the seabed. Fierce predators such as arthropods face them head-on. The first arthropods of the Cambrian period were small animals just a few centimeters long. They had a light carapace. By the Ordovician period, however, arthropods had evolved into gigantic sea monsters. The thin carapace gave way to armored armor. One of the super predators of the time is a close relative of the horseshoe crab, which appeared in the Ordovician period and is still with us today. This is the Eurypterid, a cousin of spiders and scorpions. It is also known as the sea scorpion. The Eurypterid has an elongated body ending in a jointed tail. Its cephalothorax has several pairs of eyes and pincers. It is a predator, but can also be a scavenger or omnivore. Most species have a very fine sting at the end of their tail to inject venom into their prey. Eurypterids vary greatly in size, but the average is around 1 meter or 3 feet. Large Eurypterids are lightly built. The body segments are thin and unmineralized, making for a lighter skeleton and easier movement. Another known predator of the time was the cephalopod, Orthocerid. It was one of the first to swim in open water, making it the first predator to ply the open sea. This cephalopod has a straight univalve shell. It can measure from a few centimeters to 11 meters or 36 feet in length for the largest specimens, and is considered a formidable predator. Out at sea on the supercontinent Gondwana, it's dead calm. On closer inspection, a few lichens and spores can be spotted. But the continental surface still resembles a great desert. The Ordovician period ended with a catastrophe that triggered a major mass extinction, ranked second in severity. Between 70 and 80% of all species were wiped out, from the surface of the earth to the depths of the seas. Although the causes of this catastrophe are not yet the subject of scientific consensus, it would appear that the Earth was hit by radiation from the explosion of a supernova. This irradiation literally changed the atmosphere and degraded the ozone layer. With the sun's rays no longer reaching the Earth, the latter would have experienced a phenomenon known as freeze-up. "443 million years ago, the ballet of continents is still in progress. Following the mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician period, the ocean is now empty. Many families, genera, and animal species have disappeared forever, the 3 continents of Siberia, Baltica, and Laurentia, which form a gigantic archipelago north of Gondwana, begin to move closer together. Eventually, they come together to form the supercontinent Laurasia. As a result of their collision, an immense mountain range called the Caledonian Chain was formed. It cuts right across Laurasia. We are also beginning to see the beginnings of another mountain range, the Hercynian Chain, which will really take shape tens of millions of years later when the supercontinent Pangea emerges. The glaciers that had formed at the time of the Ordovician extinction begin to melt. Sea levels rise and some species develop considerably. With no ice caps, Laurasia enjoys mild temperatures, stabilizing at around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Plants comparable to today's lichens and mosses remain on Earth. These colonizers cling to the rocks in every nook and cranny. They then develop spikes. Water does not yet circulate in their tissues. Some plants develop the ability to revive. In order to resist drought, they are able to dry out completely and rehydrate as soon as it rains. Others adopt a different strategy to resist drought. They cover themselves with an impermeable cuticle to limit water loss. All these plants disperse spores that resist desiccation thanks to a protective envelope. The morphology of these first land plants is relatively simple. They have small, more or less branched leafless sacs. They may lie flat or be somewhat erect, and have a very primitive vascular system. These plants are associated with the first colonization of the aerial and mineral environment. Thanks to their degradation by microorganisms, they provided the material needed to form the first plant-based soils. A whole new ecosystem was created. Certain organisms tried out new living conditions, and new ones appeared. While dry land was still almost a desert, and organisms thrived mainly by the water's edge, the first plants tried to gain a foothold. Such is the case with Cooksonia. Cooksonia is one of the first land plants to develop in coastal and marshy areas. Its organization is extremely simple. It has only axes without leaves or roots. The creeping axes are fitted with rhizomes so that the plant can attach itself to the soil. The rhizomes also provide the plant with the mineral salts and water it needs. Cooksonia grows to around 7 centimeters or 3 inches in height. At the very top of its stems are sporangia, the organs that emit the spores. As Cooksonia has no leaves, it is certainly these stems that carry out photosynthesis. Now that the first plants have managed to set foot on dry land, they are starting to colonize the entire continents. This is how Laurasia came to be invaded by new branches of plants that effectively conquered the terrestrial environment. Although the first terrestrial plants were very simple organisms with no conductive vessels, they had one major advantage. They were autotrophic. All they need to survive is light, water, and CO2. This is how plants develop the ability to grow higher and higher in search of light that might otherwise be covered by another plant. Simple stems gradually give way to thorns that capture even more light. Then large leaves appear, acting as solar panels that are also useful for photosynthesis. It's a veritable explosion of form and innovation in the plant world. Plants are equipped with vessels to circulate water and minerals, rhizoids, hairs that help the plant adhere to the substrate, and roots to draw mineral resources and water from the soil. The tissues stiffen thanks to lignin, enabling the plant to climb higher and higher. It would only take a few million years for forests to form, with trees reaching heights of 30 meters or 100 feet. But it won't be on Laurasia. This development of the plant world has not gone unnoticed by another family, the Arthropods. The conquest of land by vegetation has enabled them to follow suit. Already equipped with carapaces and articulated limbs, they are supported and can easily adapt to gravity. What's more, the sea dumps a variety of corpses on the shore, providing food that is highly attractive to carnivorous arthropods. Strudiella devonica is an insect relative of the first grasshoppers. These small animals thrive on the Laurasia coast among mosses and early plants. Only 8 millimeters long, Strudiella devonica is wingless. Presumably an omnivore, it has 6 legs and 2 antennae. It already possesses mandibles typical of winged insects, such as those found in cockroaches and grasshoppers today. There are also centipede-like creatures, as well as spiders and scorpions. 100 million years before they emerged from the sea, these arthropods revealed their formidable talents as explorers. Even today, 90% of life forms on Earth are arthropods, including insects. The smallest arthropods have the easiest time surviving. The bigger they are, and the heavier their shells, the harder it is for them to breathe. Ants do rather well. In the shallows of the Lapitous Ocean, life is booming. Coral, crinoids, brachiopods, trilobites, and nautiloids are all present. Large marine arthropods such as eurypterids are still with us. They are the biggest predators not only of the oceans, but also of the planet. The first jawed fish appeared, the placoderms. Their primitive toothless jaws feature sharp asperites and bony outgrowths. Some of them would grow to significant sizes within a few million years, such as Dunkleosteus, which can exceed 8 meters in length. By 416 million years ago, Gondwana, which encompasses most of the southern hemisphere, was slowly moving northwards, where Laurasia is located. The two inevitably collide. Their collision will form a single supercontinent, Pangea. The Panthalassa Ocean covers the rest of the planet. Around 350 million years ago, Pangea, the last supercontinent, was formed. The Earth has just emerged from a catastrophe that caused an intense mass extinction, the Devonian mass extinction. Over 70% of marine species disappeared from the Earth's surface. The cause was a giant plume that pierced the Earth's crust, spilling an ocean of magma over immeasurable distances. It was in the bowels of the Earth, beneath present-day Siberia, that this killer boiling matter accumulated. Excessive eruptions released thousands of tons of molten rock. Underwater earthquakes destroyed everything beneath the oceans, and the water began to heat up considerably, harming marine fauna. First, the ocean is contaminated. When lava comes into contact with seawater, it generates substances that are harmful to living organisms. Next, the gases are released into the atmosphere. The air becomes charged with greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide becomes present in large quantities. It's hot on Earth, and in the oceans, ocean currents are at a standstill, with temperatures reaching over 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Marine life is dying. Placoderms are unable to survive. Magma continues to flow 250,000 years after the eruption. Vegetation, benefiting from an atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide, colonizes continental surfaces. As the leaves die, they fall to the ground and accumulate. The planet's first humus layer is formed. This is then carried to the oceans by rainfall, where it feeds algae. Algae grow in abundance, leaving no room for other forms of life. On land, clouds of ash several kilometers high reach the atmosphere. Still burning, the ashes fall back to Earth, setting off gigantic fires. The ash clouds also darken the sky, and the Earth begins a long period of volcanic winter. Temperatures now plummet. Species have no time to adapt to these drastic climatic changes. This extinction led to the disappearance of 19% of families and 35 to 50% of marine animal genera. You'd think it was all over, but it's not. Trees, which had contributed to this mass extinction, are now helping to breathe new life into the Earth. Thanks to them, oxygen production is gradually increasing every year. Temperatures become stable, and the seasons reappear. The biosphere diversifies once again. A new period begins in Pangea, the Carboniferous. Lauretia and Gondwana, supercontinents themselves born of the breakup of Rodinia several million years ago, come together again to form Pangea. But this assembly took a long time. It lasted until the Permian. Surrounding the supercontinent is a superocean called Panthalassa. The plate tectonics involved in the formation of Pangea raised ocean levels, drowning a large number of plants in the early part of the period. During the first part of the Carboniferous, temperatures remained mild and stable. During the second part of the Carboniferous, temperatures fell. The very first tetrapods appeared in the Upper Devonian around 375 million years ago. Tetrapodomorphs made the transition from fish to tetrapods. Their robust pectoral fins were stiffened by a bony skeleton. They are now beginning to resemble legs. Tetrapods are mostly aerial and terrestrial vertebrates. They have four-toed limbs. Today, tetrapods are represented by amphibians and amniotes, which include reptiles, birds, and mammals. During the Devonian, Acanthostega is considered to be the first tetrapod with distinctive articulated locomotor appendages. It had 8 toes on each foot. However, it was not fully adapted to life on land. Indeed, its skeleton could not support the weight of its body on land. With a maximum length of 1 meter, Acanthostega has heavy bones and a lateral line like that of fish. It is an imposing animal that is still dependent on the aquatic environment. It is a perfect illustration of the fact that the conquest of the terrestrial environment was based on numerous adaptations to the aquatic environment. Pulmonary respiration is an adaptation to life in an oxygen-poor aquatic environment, such as a warm swamp. The ability to walk is an adaptation to travel in congested environments such as mangroves. Locomotor limbs may have developed for walking in deep water. Progressive adaptations are really useful for a fully terrestrial life. Tetrapods adapted to their new life in the air, acquiring an amniotic sac. Although life had long been confined to the water, it gradually began to emerge. Plants were the first, followed by animals, which timidly but surely made their way onto land. Nevertheless, they remained dependent on water for their food, and above all for their reproduction. It is therefore impossible for them to move away from aquatic zones and venture into arid environments. Around 310 million years ago, one of the oldest known reptiles, Hylonomus, introduced a major innovation, the amnion. This envelope allows the amniote embryo to develop in a liquid environment. This protects the embryo from drying out, but also from shocks. It can now be laid outside any aquatic environment. At the same time, reptiles see their skin evolve into a much drier, watertight texture. This slows down water loss through the skin. Tetrapods considerably reduce their dependence on water. From now on, new doors will be open to them towards new territories that were previously inaccessible. Reptiles diversified into numerous groups, including lizards, snakes, birds, mammals, crocodilians, turtles. Vast forests begin to appear. Immense ferns develop, as do bark and seed trees. This new environment also facilitated the evolution of tetrapods. The coal we consume today comes from the forests that developed during the Carboniferous period. When tectonic movement ceased, the landforms stopped moving. Rocks are only degraded by weathering and erosion. The products of erosion accumulate in the low-lying areas surrounding the landforms. With the tropical climate that reigned over Pangea at this time, abundant vegetation proliferated on the sediments produced by the products of degradation. The materials pile up and settle. From time to time, sand and clays appear. Emergent areas fill with ferns and conifers, forming immense forests that are ideal insect habitats. Marshy soils are colonized by large amphibians. When trees die, their trunks fall to the ground. Since sedimentation is important, these are quickly buried under leaves, so quickly that the organic matter has no time to decompose. Over the years, the clays and sands harden into shale and sandstone. Organic matter becomes peat, lignite, coal, and then anthracite. These products contain more and more carbon, and therefore more and more energy. Subjected to flooding and submersion, the coal seams are separated by layers of shale and sandstone, which also contain organic matter. It was this coal that was used on a massive scale during the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. Carboniferous forests are mainly composed of large arborescent lycophytes, calamites, and tree ferns. Among these plants, which produce neither flowers nor seeds, we also find the first primitive conifers. the chordiatails, as well as another now extinct group, the pteridospermales, which are the seed ferns. Among the large arborescent lycophytes is the lepidodendron. This primitive tree abounds on Pangea and was one of the first plants to reach gigantic proportions. It grows to a height of 40 meters, or 130 feet, with a trunk up to 2 meters, or 6 feet wide at the base. Its crown is shaped like a giant broccoli. Its leaves sprout from the trunk and form spirals. As they fall, they scar the tree trunk. Lepidodendron produces spores. Calamite is a species of giant horsetail. It can grow to around 20 meters or 65 feet in height, and is very abundant on Pangea, in marshy and sandy areas. Calamites develop numerous stolons, which are underground branches that enable them to grow. In this way, they can grow new stems in case any are in poor condition. Their trunks can reach up to 1 meter or 3 feet in diameter. The leaves of the calamite grow larger and larger, depending on the arrangement of the stems. While the lepidodendron is very similar to a tree, another group, the ferns, developed extensively and left their mark on the Carboniferous period. These plants formed immense swamps that covered the continental surface. The Watieza is one of the oldest known trees. It closely resembles our modern palms. It measures up to 8 meters or 26 feet in height. Watieza has no leaves but fronds. They stand vertically, inserted into the trunk. The rather slender trunk has an inverted conical shape. Its small roots penetrate perpendicularly into the soil to keep the plant upright, despite its imposing size. Leaves are produced in large quantities. Once dead, they lie on the ground like a carpet, providing a habitat for small animals. The Sauronius, although reaching the size of a tree, is a fern. It reaches heights of up to 10 meters, or 33 feet, and its trunk can be up to 1 meter, or 3 feet in diameter. Sauronius has magnificent fronds that can reach up to 3 meters, or 10 feet in length. This fern has no real trunk. It is supported by a thick root mantle of rootlets. Within this mantle, a whole ecosystem proliferates. Other plants and epiphytes can also be found here. 390 million years ago, seed-producing plants, known as spermatophytes, were slowly developing. Thanks to this new branch of plants, dissemination is no longer ensured by spores, but by seeds. Seeds are protected by protective envelopes that contain the embryo and all the reserves it needs during the early stages of its development. When the seed detaches from the plant, it ensures the distribution of the species, which is facilitated by its small size, but also by small hooks, enabling it to attach itself to animals and appendages, enabling it to catch the wind. Plants are no longer dependent on water. Their reproduction becomes aerial. What's more, the seed can go dormant. This means that its state of life can slow down, allowing it to reach conditions favorable to germination. The appearance of the seed is a veritable botanical revolution. Some spermatophyte plants have a naked seed. This is the case of conifers. Conifers are highly adapted to the warm climate of the Carboniferous and will conquer ecological niches left vacant. These seed-bearing vascular plants are cone-shaped, hence their name. Today, they are still found all over the world. Conifers are extremely hardy woody plants and have survived many upheavals in Earth's history, including climate change, volcanic eruptions, and the later appearance of flowering plants. Primitive conifers that evolved during the Carboniferous include genera such as Chordiates and the Archaeopteridales group. Chordites are trees with needle-like leaves and cones. They share certain characteristics with modern conifers. The largest leaves can reach 1 meter or 3 feet long and 15 centimeters or 6 inches wide. The leaves, arranged helically on the branches, resemble long ribbons with parallel veins. Chordites thrive in marshes, wetland edges, and drier habitats. The largest trees can reach up to 45 meters or 150 feet in height. Archaeopteridales are vascular plants that resemble tree ferns, but are considered ancestors of conifers. Their most famous representative is Archaeopteris. Archaeopteris appeared in the Devonian, but remained until the Carboniferous. It belongs to the progymnosperm group, the origin of the gymnosperms. This tree is a veritable giant, reaching heights of up to 40 meters or 130 feet. Its trunk is made of lignin and cellulose, and although it is very similar to modern conifers, it was a new material at the time. Archaeopteris's fronds spread out from its crown, giving it a fern-like appearance. They are oriented horizontally and have photosynthetic organs that were exceptional for the time, enabling the tree to take maximum advantage of sunlight. During the Carboniferous period, life on Pangea was characterized by widespread gigantism. Giant plant and animal organisms inhabited the continental surface. Many new plants appeared, but few bacteria were able to digest them. Most of the components derived from these plants are buried in the soil. Plants practice photosynthesis. They synthesize organic matter using carbon dioxide, water, and light, and release oxygen. Oxygen levels in the air were as high as 35%, compared with 21% today. The Carboniferous is called the Age of Oxygen. An animal's ability to breathe has consequences for its size. During the Carboniferous, insects grew to gigantic sizes, becoming predators for early reptiles and amphibians. Arthropods have a circulatory system in which their blood is not confined within blood vessels. It circulates freely in body cavities. They also have tiny openings on the surface of their bodies to allow oxygen from the atmosphere to reach their circulatory systems. They are therefore highly sensitive to variations in atmospheric oxygen levels. This hyperoxygenated atmosphere benefits not only arthropods, which include insects, spiders, and crustaceans, but also certain vertebrate species. Meganeura monii is the largest dragonfly in the history of the Earth. It can reach a wingspan of over 70 centimeters or 28 inches, a length of 30 centimeters or 12 inches, and an estimated weight of 150 grams. It lives close to rivers and waterholes. Meganeura monii has large contiguous eyes, giving it nearly 360-degree vision. At this time, it becomes a super predator. It hunts other insects by biting them while flying, unlike today's dragonflies, which hunt from a position using their legs. Meganeura monii also preys on early reptiles that litter the ground. Alongside Meganeura monii is another giant of the period, Megarachni. Megarachni is a species of the Eurypterid family. It is related to the arachnids and bears some resemblance to our modern-day spiders. Megarachni measures up to 35 centimeters or 14 inches in length. The distance between each of its legs is over 60 centimeters or 24 inches. Like Meganeura, it is also a super predator and has very few enemies. Megarachni's prey includes Arthropods, a gigantic scolopender. Arthropods is a giant centipede reaching up to 2.5 meters or 8 feet in length, with an estimated mass of 50 kilograms or 110 pounds. It is the largest arthropod known to have ever walked the Earth's surface. Even if it wasn't a super predator, its gigantism doesn't make it prey. Arthropods appears to be a herbivore, living in damp, swampy environments. Its flattened body is made up of some 30 articulated segments. Each is covered by 2 lateral plates and a central plate. Pulmonoscorpius is a giant scorpion and one of the largest arachnids known to date. The shape of its lungs alternates between tissue and air pockets, earning it the name breathing scorpion. It can reach up to 70 centimeters or 28 inches in length. Pulmonoscorpius is equipped with powerful pincers, as well as a stinger, enabling it to inject toxic venom into its prey and potential predators. This super predator probably feeds on arthropods and small tetrapods. Diplocaulus is a genus of amphibian that appeared during the Permian period after the Carboniferous. It is one of the largest lepospondylids known to date. It can grow up to 1 meter or 3 feet long, and its body is flat, barely 10 centimeters or 4 inches high. Although particularly large, Diplocaulus is characterized above all by its spectacular head, with a skull shaped like a boomerang. It is totally disproportionate to the rest of his body. The functions of this strange head are not yet well defined. His skull could serve as a defensive weapon, making him difficult to swallow. But other theories suggest that this boomerang-like shape could help the animal move through water. Diplocaulus thrives in marshes and large pools. It can therefore live alternately in water and on land. It feeds on a variety of fish, as well as insects and other smaller amphibians. For several million years now, planet Earth has been going through a period of calm. But at the end of the Permian, a relatively large mass extinction occurred. During the Permian, the supercontinent Pangea continued to form, but not without consequences. The surface area of shallow marine waters and coastal zones shrank dramatically. The coming together of continental masses led to a drop in temperature, and volcanism became much more intense. The Earth is undergoing its 3rd mass extinction, which will undoubtedly be the most devastating. On the continent, 70% of species are disappearing. As for marine life, half of all families, 3/4 of all genera, and 95% of all species are extinct. No group avoided the catastrophe, but they all suffered it to varying degrees. Trilobites, reef-building corals, and other marine microorganisms have been totally wiped out. Brachiopods, or ferns on the continental surface, were decimated. Bivalve mollusks, fish and tetrapods, were less affected. This catastrophe marks the boundary between two eras, the primary and the secondary. The magnitude of this catastrophe is the result of the cumulative effects of two volcanic events separated by barely 6 million years. The emissions from Mount Emi 258 million years ago and the huge lava flows in Siberia 252 million years ago greatly disrupted the climate of the time. But these weren't the only incidents. In the aftermath of the Permian extinction, the Earth's landscapes are dotted with ferns, horsetails, lycopods, and mosses. So far, not a hint of color. Flowering plants have yet to appear. The entire landmass is gathered in Pangea, but during this era, the supercontinent slowly began to fragment. The Mesozoic was marked by the appearance and diversification of the most famous animals, the dinosaurs. The name dinosaur means terrible lizard in Greek and highlights their characteristic outsized size. This group of animals is highly diverse and a major evolutionary success story. They can be found on every continent and come in a wide variety of forms, although they are essentially terrestrial. There are flying, bipedal, and quadrupedal dinosaurs. They can also be carnivorous or herbivorous. At the beginning of the Triassic period, 230 million years ago, the Earth was slowly recovering from the Permian extinction. Ecological niches were left vacant, and these reptiles rushed to fill them. Dinosaurs reigned supreme over Pangea and remained so until the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago. At the beginning of the Triassic, dinosaurs were not the giants that would appear later in the Cretaceous. The Eoraptor, for example, measures 1 meter in length, around 40 centimeters in height, and weighs around 10 kilograms, or 22 pounds. Its hands each have 5 fingers, the 3 longest of which end in a large claw, enabling them to attack prey, but also to grab plants. It has no evolved predatory morphology and is a primitive dinosaur. The first insect-eating flying reptiles, pterosaurs, like Eudomorphodon, make their appearance. Eudomorphodon has a wingspan of around 1 meter or 3 feet. It has a long diamond-shaped tail. Eudomorphodon has over 100 teeth. Its jaws are specialized and particularly well-suited to capturing fish. Its morphological characteristics enable it to fly actively. Although dinosaurs were the focus of attention, the mammalian branch continued to diversify. At the beginning of the Triassic period, we find numerous therapsids, decynodonts such as Lystrosaurus. Then, during the Triassic period, they declined due to the emergence of cynodonts. Lystrosaurus is an animal measuring up to 2 meters or 7 feet. It has a robust body and short limbs. It is a burrower. Its nostrils are high up, almost at eye level. Its jaw is equipped with a pair of tusks, used for scraping in the ground, but also for self-defense. It feeds on roots and small plants. At the end of the Triassic period came the first mammalia forms, represented in particular by Megazostrodon, which are very close relatives of mammals. With a morphology close to that of today's shrews, Megazostrodon is 12 centimeters or 5 inches long. It feeds on lizards and insects and hunts at night. Its brain is more developed than that of its ancestors, particularly in the areas devoted to smell and sight. Its small size is a weakness among the first dinosaurs to emerge. In the oceans, chondrichthyans, distant cousins of our sharks, take center stage. Alongside them, marine reptiles are gaining in importance. Although several families emerged, the big winners of this marine diversity were the ichthyosaurs, which remained throughout the Secondary era and became extinct in the Cretaceous. These true marine predators, at the top of the food chain, measured up to 20 meters or 65 feet in length. Their powerful fins enable them to move underwater at speeds of up to 40 kilometers per hour or 25 miles per hour. These viviparous reptiles are able to give birth to live young and are already capable of swimming. They have elongated snouts and feed on ammonites, belemnites, and fish. Their morphology is very similar to that of today's dolphins. They are capable of diving to great depths, but also of surfacing. The ichthyosaur's large eyes enable it to see in the dark when it dives deep into the ocean at night. All this little world is getting its bearings on Pangea, which isn't going to stay calm for long. The forces that brought it together millions of years ago are now rumbling to split it apart. $250 million years ago, the beginning of the Secondary era saw the fragmentation of Pangea, following the cycle of continental plates coming together and breaking apart. However, this dislocation became truly intense at the end of the Triassic period, around 200 million years ago. Part of the Panthalassa Ocean sinks into the western part of Pangea. It was here that an oceanic opening formed, widened, and advanced westwards to form a new ocean, the Thetis. This ocean will continue to expand. The ecological, climatic, and geographic consequences are immense. Rifts were created, separating North America from Africa. The mid-ocean rifts are active, warm and swollen. Mean sea level rises. Continental surfaces split, and marine areas expand. At this point, a volcanic episode produces immense outpourings, and the planet enters a period of abrupt climate change. Temperatures drop sharply before rising again in a very short space of time. Ocean currents change. Warmer temperatures reduce exchanges between cold and warm waters. Water circulation slows, and the ocean floor becomes less oxygenated. Biodiversity is greatly affected by these changes. Whereas Pangea had a continental climate, the planet as a whole is now experiencing a more oceanic climate. Pangea broke up into two new continents, Gondwana and Laurasia. Laurasia is a supercontinent formed from the fragmentation of Pangea at the end of the Triassic period. When the Thetis Ocean developed, it divided the supercontinent, into Laurasia to the north and Gondwana to the south. Laurasia includes North America, Eurasia, and part of the Arctic. Henceforth, lands are separated. Opportunities for reproduction and genetic exchange between individuals of the same species are diminishing. This separation did not happen overnight, and exchanges diminished over millions of years. Populations now become species in their own right. They diversify and develop on both continents. Laurasia is characterized by a great diversity of ecosystems. A wide variety of plant and animal species inhabit it, and differ from those residing in Gondwana due to different environmental conditions. During this period, dinosaurs became the emblematic inhabitants. From then on, they grew to enormous sizes. The first mammals also made a discrete appearance. Laurasia remained in place until around 65 million years ago, when it in turn split into Eurasia and North America with the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean. Tectonic forces then caused the fragments of Laurasia to drift apart, giving the Earth its present face. The Earth is alive. Its continental plates are constantly moving, always have been, and will continue to do so as long as the bowels of the planet are hot enough. The Mediterranean Sea is the remnant of the Tethys Ocean. When the southern Atlantic Ocean began to open up, southern Africa turned in on itself. Its northeastern coast moved closer to northern Eurasia. The Tethys Ocean began to close. All that remains today is the Mediterranean Sea, which itself is inevitably shrinking. In a few million years, this sea will certainly be reduced to a few small lakes. We are currently halfway through the Wilson cycle. Within 250 million years, a new supercontinent will form. Pangea Proxima is the next supercontinent that could form as a result of the coming together of Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas, followed by the collision of Australia and Antarctica. The sponge is the oldest known animal. It is thought to have appeared over 890 million years ago. These primitive animals had no nervous, vascular, or digestive systems. Over several million years, these primitive animals evolved into the first, more complex animals during the Ediacaran period 600 million years ago. While living organisms were mostly simple, made up of individual cells, or sometimes grouped together in colonies, a veritable zoological Big Bang occurred during the Cambrian, between 541 and 530 million years ago. This explosion of organisms led to the sudden appearance of most of today's major phyla of multicellular animals. This event initiated a gigantic diversification of animal, plant, and bacterial classes and species. The Earth consists of a single continent, Rodinia, surrounded by an immense ocean called Morovia. But this supercontinent is beginning to break up, and new pieces of continent are appearing. The largest of these will occupy most of the southern hemisphere, Proto-Gondwana. To the north, the other pieces form a large archipelago, with Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia. the planetary climate is warm, around 25 degrees Celsius or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. In the center of Laurentia, Baltica, and Siberia, an ocean called Iapetus forms. In its shallows, animal life explodes. Most were soft-bodied animals such as worms and sponges, but there were also the first arthropods, distant ancestors of today's insects and crustaceans, ancestors of future cephalopods, as well as animals that had no descendants. They all evolved on the ocean floor. This new fauna now possesses internal and external organs such as eyes, legs, digestive system, antennae, mouth apparatus. A food chain now exists. Microorganisms such as trilobites form the bottom of this chain, and at the very top is a super predator, Anomalocaris. Anomalocaris is a genus of arthropods and the first known predator in the history of life. Its distinctive feature is its large, complete visual organs, compound eyes. 2 to 3 centimeters or 1 inch long, they have 16,000 facets. Its eyesight, though primitive, enables it to distinguish potential prey, which is already a formidable evolutionary asset. Its long, narrow body measures less than a meter. It is covered by a mineral-free exoskeleton and possesses a toothy mouth, flexible legs, and a long V-shaped tail, which must have enabled it to propel itself swiftly through the water. Its 28 lateral fins are arranged in pairs. Alongside him are many other animals, each more original than the last. Less spectacular in terms of size, Hallucinogea sparsa has a long, slender, worm-like body, measuring up to 3 centimeters or 1 inch. A predatory ancestor of cephalopods, Nectocaris pteryx, is described as having a head with 2 eyes, 1 or 2 pairs of appendages, and an oval carapace at the rear. But the specimen that really catches our attention is the famous Pangea, a species of worm or eel just a few centimeters long. Its protodorsal spine suggests that it was the first animal of the chordate phylum, or even the precursor of the vertebrate branch. Today, however, there is no unanimity on this last point. This animal has a chord, a primitive spinal column running the length of the animal. It is from this chord that the muscles and organs that make up the animal are assembled. In the space of a few million years, all the pieces needed for the great adventure of the evolution of the animal world were in place. This Cambrian explosion was halted at the end of the period by an extinction caused by glaciation and a sudden change in temperature. Nearly 40% of species became extinct. Although ecological niches were left vacant, they were rapidly taken over by surviving species during the Ordovician period, leading to evolutionary radiation. Glaciation lowered sea levels and increased the number of shoals. The surviving species multiply, and although the ocean is calmer, it soon becomes populated by animals of all kinds. The families and genera of marine organisms multiply. This is the event of the Great Ordovician biodiversification. The rapid diversification of plankton favored the development of marine fauna living on the ocean floor. Crinoids, bivalve brachiopods and trilobites multiply, but new arrivals also develop. Corals colonize the oceans and build coral reefs. They enrich the marine fauna. Land seems lifeless, and yet, on closer inspection, a few lichens are beginning to set their sights on it. A lichen is a fungus associated with an algae that grows where no plant can live. The fungus and the algae live in a symbiotic relationship, rather like coral. The fungus protects the algae. It protects it with water and mineral salts. The algae produces sugars and other products that it shares with the fungus. They can be found on rocks by the sea or on cooled lava. At first sight, nothing very extraordinary, and yet, when they rot, lichens leave debris that forms a soil rich enough for moss and other plants to grow. The ground is slowly prepared. The tiny advance of life on Earth is about to be halted by a mass extinction. Glaciation sets in, wiping out many species and slowing down the momentum that some life forms were beginning to build up out of the water. The ocean, once teeming with life, is now calm. Many families, genera, and species of animals and plants have disappeared. There's a kind of void, but nature hastened to fill it, and the surviving species underwent an evolutionary radiation. The continents continue to move. Siberia, Baltica, and Laurentia, which had formed a mega archipelago, moved closer to Proto-Gondwana. Over time, they formed the supercontinent Laurasia. The collision of these lands gave rise to a gigantic mountain range, the Caledonian Chain. Then the ice began to melt. Ocean levels rise, and certain species develop considerably. With the ice cap gone, the climate becomes mild again, with temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. What about the mainland? We find the lichens that were already starting to appear before the extinction. The first mosses are now appearing, and the flora will begin to establish itself out of the water. While life abounded in the depths of the sea, the landscape on land at the time consisted of bare, windswept rock as far as the eye could see. Then, as they pass, high and low tides leave sediments at the water's edge. This sediment is the first holdfast for plant life. The oldest known trace of primitive plants is that of Cooksonia. High and low tides and the consequent alternation between the passage of water and the drying out of the water allow the flora to gradually become accustomed to life outside the water. Cooksonia plants grow to less than 10 centimeters in height and have a relatively simple structure. They have no leaves or flowers, only a stem that divides into several branches. Each branch ends in a rounded sporangium containing the spores. A priori, it has no roots and is attached to the ground by radicals, fine, superficially concentrated roots. Cooksonia plants release their spores into the air to reproduce. Cooksonia and the other primitive plants are confronted with the phenomenon of gravity, a physics that is new to them. They evolved by developing a hydraulic internal skeleton and a protective layer of wax. They are better able to support their own weight and cope with drought. The cuticle prevents the plant's water from evaporating, but it also forms a layer impermeable to carbon dioxide and oxygen. Over time, plants will develop tiny openings called stomata, enabling them to breathe through the air. Some have cells to distribute water and nutrients to higher organs, but at the time of the first plants, the soil was poor in nutrients. So plants develop rhizomes, like roots, to draw the food they need from the ground. Even though the soil was still almost non-existent, plants themselves helped to build it by breaking down the rocks on which they ventured. A little later, they develop outgrowths to increase the surface area exposed to solar energy. All these primitive plants must also find a way to reproduce. They cannot, like marine plants, discharge their gametes into the water. They must now find an aerial means of reproduction. This is done via spores. These are spread by the wind, and as they germinate, produce male or female organs, which in turn release their sex cells into the moist soil. The higher the plant, the more efficient the spore dispersal. This is why some plants try to grow taller, which also gives them the advantage of capturing even more of the sun's energy than their ground-level counterparts. Now, they need to give their stems more strength to support their weight and height. To this end, they add a woody support tissue. They can grow taller and taller and develop an ever-increasing diameter. Plants reach ever greater heights, with trunks measuring at least 10 centimeters or 4 inches in diameter. This may seem ridiculous compared with our present-day forests, but this primitive vegetation has nonetheless allowed other visitors to venture onto dry land. A few critters docked and ventured out onto the newly forming vegetation. But who are these curious little creatures? Probably earthworms, as life teems in the mud, or even mites. But the first real fossilized traces discovered are those of an extinct species of arthropod. The ebb and flow of the sea washes all kinds of organic waste and corpses onto the shore. This highly attractive food is a great incentive for carnivorous organisms to leave the waters. What's more, the desert is slowly becoming clothed in mosses, lichens, and other primitive plants, a tempting exploration ground for certain organisms. Curious, tiny, and discreet inhabitants shelter between grains of earth and roots beneath a layer of decomposing vegetation on which they feed. Primitive insects swarm in the midst of this growing vegetation. At first, the largest are no bigger than a few millimeters. They look like springtails, the pan-crustaceous jumping arthropods that populate our land today. Some are carnivores, feeding on the corpses of other animals, and others feed on plants, but none seem to attack them until they have rotted. Living plants certainly contain toxins they couldn't survive. It is these little beasts, so insignificant at first sight, that will eventually populate the whole Earth. Today, there are over 1.3 million known species of insect. They occupy almost every ecological niche. But this dominance didn't happen overnight. Although insects diversified very early on, in the Carboniferous period, they were initially present in small numbers. Campicaris obanensis belongs to the myriapod genus, closely related to millipedes. Its fossil was discovered in Scotland. Its legs have not been preserved. The animal measures approximately 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch in length. Its body is segmented. It evolved in an environment close to bodies of water, and certainly fed on decomposing plants. Although not their ancestor, they bear a striking resemblance to today's millipedes. Its body is covered by a carapace that is synthesized by its glands. Cooksonia fossils have been found in the same region. Strutiella devonica is a species of fossil arthropod. It is one of the oldest terrestrial insects found, and the only complete fossil insect. This small insect, measuring around 8 millimeters in length, appears to be a close relative of the early grasshoppers. It has a relatively large head, with robust mandibles and long antennae. This specimen is wingless, which prevents scientists from knowing whether it is a larva or an adult. Strutiella devonica has all the morphological features and organs required for terrestrial life. Its unspecialized mouth parts indicate that it had an omnivorous diet. The fossil shows 6 body segments, 6 legs, and 2 antennae. The genitalia have not been preserved. The first arthropods to set foot on Earth were faced with a number of difficulties. They needed a structure strong enough to support them, as well as arrangements to protect them from ultraviolet light and desiccation. They also needed to find food. Surprisingly, most arthropods are carnivores, and few are herbivores. And to satisfy carnivores, prey must be available. Dry land is still relatively devoid of life, and the first arthropods may have had to make do with fungi, molds, or rotting leaves. The first plants were therefore not a source of food, but they helped to shape the first ecosystems that gradually spread across the land. At the same time, as life was gaining ground on land, it was demonstrating real innovation in marine organisms. The Devonian is reputed to be the period known as the Age of Fish. Numerous gigantic armored fish, known as placoderms, crisscrossed the oceans, including Bothriolepis, Silurians, and Dunkleosteus. While life on land is represented only by small organisms, life in the oceans is luxuriant. Its evolution was not unrelated to the emergence from the sea. Placoderms are the vertebrates that dominate the marine world. They are highly diversified, frequenting both reefs and the open sea. They feed on algae, mollusks, and other fish. They owe their name placoderm to the plates that cover their skin. Their head and thorax are covered by a thick bony armor that protects vital organs such as the eyes, brain, and heart from predators. Their enormous jaws, made of bone with sharp edges, are like pincers that can cut their prey in two. Although placoderms were the first to be equipped with jaws, they still lack teeth. Around 400 million years ago, the group of jawed fish diversified into 2 major groups. On the one hand, cartilaginous fish, from which sharks, rays, and other chimeras evolved, and on the other, bony fish. Subsequently, bony fish are divided into 2 groups. Bony fish, known as actinopterygians, have fins with keratin rays, the protein that makes up hair, nails, and horns. The rays are shaped like arms that support the fin fan. Alongside them, bony fish with fleshy or lobed fins are called sarcopterygians. Their fins are characterized by bones that form an articulated internal skeleton. The ventral fin bones are identical in number and position to those of the tetrapod extremities. This new form of fin is now articulated around a single element, the other rays having disappeared. It's not yet a leg, but it sure looks like one. The fin ends in a soft veil of scales. Panderichthys is an extinct genus of sarcopterygians that is considered an anatomically transitional form in the evolution from fish to tetrapod. The internal skeleton of the pectoral and pelvic fins is reminiscent of Chiridian limbs. The best-known species is Panderichthys rhombolepis, which resembles a modern-day catfish. It measures between 90 and 130 centimeters or 50 inches. It has primitive lungs. This species marks an important stage in the adaptation to terrestrial locomotion, since its fleshy pectoral fins are prototypes of tetrapod limbs. This suggests that the transition to tetrapod locomotion, which relies on hind limb propulsion, went through a stage of forelimb support accompanied by body undulation. In fact, the pelvic fins of Panderichthys rhombolepis are primitive and do not allow it to take support. A few million years later, the veil at the end of the fin would evolve into a revolutionary structure in living organisms: fingers. Meanwhile, vegetation continued to grow. Primitive plants have grown so much that they can now be called trees. It took a good 50 million years for the first giant ferns, calamites, and lepidodendrons to reach heights of over 30 meters or 100 feet. At this size, the trunk is reinforced with wood and bark, like that of today's trees. The arborescent form appeared independently in different plant groups. Archaeopteris is like a fern with a coniferous trunk. It thrives in well-drained areas where it can develop its extensive root system. It contributes to the formation of deep soils. It can reach heights of up to 40 meters or 130 feet, and measure up to 1.5 meters or 5 feet in diameter. Its wood is similar to that of conifers, with tracheids and rays. Many scientists have studied the anatomy of its trunk, making it the first modern tree. The wood of Archaeopteris becomes both a conductive tissue and a support element, an ideal combination for seeking light at height. Watieza is a close relative of modern ferns and horsetails. It is one of the components of the oldest forests and is considered the oldest arborescent plant. Its general appearance is reminiscent of modern palm trees or tree ferns. It can reach heights of up to 8 meters. Instead of leaves, Watieza has fronds located in the crown in a vertical position and positioned helically on the trunk. In some plants, fronds play the role of leaves. They are often large and divided into segments. As it grows, Watieza loses its fronds, leaving scars on the surface tissue of the stem. The trunk is rather thin, with grooves in the area around the crown, the scars of the lost fronds. This tall plant remains upright thanks to its inverted conical morphology and the large number of small roots that penetrate perpendicularly into the soil. One representative of the first forests is the Gilboa petrified forest in the United States. This forest was discovered during the excavation of a quarry to build the Gilboa Dam. Hundreds of large fossilized stumps preserved in the rock were identified. It would take several years of study and research to understand this forest a little better. The bases of the trees making up the forest are bowl-shaped, and their diameter can reach up to 2 meters or 7 feet. Thousands of roots surround them. According to estimates, the tree could reach up to 10 meters or 33 feet in height, and resemble palm trees or tree ferns. Horizontal woody stems, measuring around 15 centimeters or 6 inches in diameter, were also discovered. These are creeping trunks of a neurophytalian progymnosperm, previously known only for their upright branches. A large specimen of lycopod was also discovered. This herbaceous plant has axes covered with small, narrow, microphyllous leaves. Fertile leaves have 5 segments. Like vegetative leaves, and sporangia are inserted on the upper surface of each. This primitive forest already displays extraordinary complexity. The Tiktaalik roseae is the only known species of Tiktaalik, which literally means great fish of the low waters. The Tiktaalik has all the characteristics of a fish. It has scales and gills, but its triangular, flattened head and unusually shaped fins stand out. In fact, in addition to the fine ray-shaped bones that all fish have for paddling, the fins have much stronger internal bones, enabling the animal to wedge itself in shallow water using its limbs for support. This is what most four-legged animals do. This particular fin makes Tiktaalik a transitional species between fishes and Pandorictus, and the future first tetrapods, Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. The fins of Tiktaalik roseae have wrist bones and simple finger-like rays. It has gills but also primitive lungs. This enables it to establish itself in shallow waters and on land. Its scales are diamond-shaped, its teeth are structured in 2 rows, and it has internal and external nostrils. Most fish have bony plates in the gill area, limiting head movement. Tiktaalik roseae has none. This makes it the first known fish to have a neck and pectoral girdle separate from the skull. This gives it greater freedom to hunt prey, whether in the water or on land. The rays of Tiktaalik roseae's pectoral fins, those that evolved to form the front legs of tetrapods, have become more robust, and an asymmetry has developed between the rays on the ventral and dorsal sides. The latter become wider and more numerous than the former. This characteristic has resulted in a fleshy, palm-like part that the animal can use to hold itself up on the ground or in rivers. This suggests the presence of muscles under the fins to support the animal's weight when pulling itself up in the open air. Another visible evolution on the animal is that its eyes and nostrils are positioned above the head. As brackish waters are low in oxygen, it is forced to breathe at the surface. This feature enables it to breathe without taking its head out of the water, like today's crocodiles. Tiktaalik roseae is somewhere between a fish and a tetrapod. Its anatomical characteristics make it an intermediate species. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were among the first tetrapods, defined as legged fish. They were aquatic animals with gills, but their 8-toed legs enabled them to navigate muddy, cluttered environments out of the water. Acanthostega is considered one of the first terrestrial vertebrates. It has chiridial limbs, articulated locomotor appendages equipped with fingers, an anatomical feature of the first tetrapods. Acanthostega measures around 60 centimeters in length. On each of its hands it has 8 fingers linked by a tendinous sheath. It has no wrists but a shoulder and a forelimb similar to those of a fish. However, the shoulder and forelimb cannot be bent forward or at the elbow, and cannot be used for standing or walking. He therefore had to use them for paddling or clinging to vegetation. Its pelvic girdle becomes a load-bearing structure, enabling it to counteract the force of gravity when it is no longer in the water. Although Acanthostega has lungs, its ribs are too short to support the rib cage outside an aquatic environment. Many scientists agree that Acanthostega would never have lived outside the sea and would have been primarily an aquatic animal. It must have come ashore to find food. Its jaw shows a difference from that of fish, which would have enabled it to feed on food either out of the water or on land. Alongside Acanthostega, Ichthyostega is one of the oldest known four-limbed vertebrates. Ichthyostega is a rather large animal for its time, measuring around 1.5 meters or 5 feet in length. Its eyes are set on top of a flattened skull, and it has large teeth. Its limbs are long, with 7 toes on each end of the hind limbs. The morphology of its shoulder and pelvic girdles is more robust and better adapted to terrestrial life than that of Acanthostega. Its vertebrae are also stronger. How did the fingers get added to the limb tips of these early tetrapods? Were the fingers pre-existing elements, or did they transform and evolve over time? The latest research suggests that the fingers originated from abnormal growth of the fin tips. In the fish embryo, the fin tips form the apical ridge through which the bony rays of the fin are formed. Once all the rays have formed, the ridge peels off, stopping the construction of new bony structures on the fin. The fin then forms a veil and completes its development. The anomaly that led to the development of the fingers would have been that the apical ridge failed to detach. After forming the bones of the arm, forearm, and wrist, it then went on to build the phalanges. With their fingers, Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were able to survey muddy deltas dotted with plants and tree branches. They were able to spread branches and wade through mud, as well as move from one arm of a river to the other. Their life remained essentially aquatic. Their legs are still not very functional, as the absence of joints makes them very rigid. As they have no ankles, they are unable to extend themselves. These protopatties are therefore only good for carrying fish and being used as paddles for travel. Finally, at the end of the Devonian period, 360 million years ago, these legs came in very handy. Terrestrial environments became increasingly vast as ocean levels dropped. Acanthostega and Ichthyostega along with their tetrapod congeners, are able to reach isolated bodies of water and rivers. They survived this new environment better than others. It was during the Carboniferous period that flexible ankles, wrists, and elbows gave them incredible mobility. They could now leave the water's edge and venture out to conquer the immense forests that had in the meantime colonized dry land. Soon after Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, sea scorpions and spiders reached dry land. But this conquest was halted by another massive glaciation, which led to a mass extinction. 75% of the species that existed in the Devonian disappeared. The Earth emerges from a major mass extinction, resulting in the death of many animals. At this time, the continents Laurasia and Gondwana come together to form a supercontinent called Pangea. It is surrounded by the Panthalassa Ocean. Tectonic plate movements cause sea levels to rise. Many of the plants that remain on dry land are drowned. But nature has not said its last word. Forests continue to colonize. In the midst of tree ferns and giant horsetails, a new tree has appeared, the Lepidodendron. It's one of the giant lycopods, oversized plants that have dominated the Earth for a long time. The Lepidodendron reaches heights of over 50 meters or 165 feet, with a trunk 2 meters or 7 feet in diameter. Its trunk is firmly anchored to the ground by numerous roots. It has no intermediate branches, but is topped by a crown of foliage arranged like a parasol. This is when bark and seed trees appear. Bark trees became the source of coal, which was used in abundance during the Industrial Revolution. Following fires or floods, these trees were buried and formed sediments. Deprived of air and subjected to high pressure, organic elements are transformed into carbon compounds. The emergence of seed plants was a botanical revolution and a new step in the development of life on land. Henceforth, plant reproduction was no longer dependent on water and became aerial. The elements that ensure the plant's dissemination are no longer spores, but seeds. These multicellular seeds are protected by protective envelopes formed by the lignified integuments of the ovule. They contain not only an embryo, but also the reserves such as carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins needed for its development during the early stages. The seed detaches from the plant and ensures the dissemination of the species. Their tiny size and hooks enable them to attach themselves to animals, while their appendages provide a grip on the wind, all characteristics that facilitate dispersal. Seeds also have another fundamental characteristic. Their tissues are dehydrated, allowing them to enter dormancy when conditions are unfavorable for germination. Seeds can therefore be buried in the soil for several years before germinating. Animals continue to develop and adapt to dry land. In the mid-Carboniferous, sea levels drop again. The extension of terrestrial environments isolates bodies of water. But tetrapods now have limbs that can bend, and they adapt very well to this new environment. They also have lungs and are ready to conquer the gigantic Carboniferous forests that offer them a moist, shady environment in which to live. Amphibians were the first tetrapods. They were able to live both in water and on land. They had lungs to breathe air, but they also had to lay their eggs in water. But a new phylum appeared during the Carboniferous period, the reptiles. These were the first tetrapods to be fully adapted to life on land. They had a body covered in scales that protected them from predators and the elements. They also laid their eggs on land. Insects developed rapidly during this period. Insects have diversified very rapidly since they first appeared. By the Carboniferous, they accounted for at least 60% of biodiversity. In just a few million years, this group outnumbered their main terrestrial competitors. Their secret? A very useful feature for survival in this world of predators: wings. The group of wingless insects known as apterygotes represents just 1% of today's insects. Their congeners have largely overtaken them. The appearance of wings is difficult to date and explain. Perhaps they were gills, modified to enable aquatic organisms to fly short distances? This is just one hypothesis among many. What is certain is that thanks to their gravity-defying wings, insects were the sole masters of the air for several million years. Although flora, with the appearance of seed plants, gradually freed themselves from the aquatic environment, animals remain dependent on water for their food, and above all for their reproduction. A major innovation occurred around 310 million years ago with the appearance of the amnion. This is the envelope that allows the amniote embryo to develop in a liquid environment. Its innovative feature is that it can be laid out of the water. The embryo is thus protected from drying out and shocks. At the same time, some animals are equipped with a dry, more or less watertight skin to slow down water loss through the skin. Several groups of vertebrates, such as reptiles, birds, and mammals, were equipped with an amniotic sac. These groups of animals can now move away from the aquatic environment, as can amphibians, which remain water-dependent. The amniotic egg, combined with the waterproof skin of the first reptiles, enabled them to venture into continental areas previously inaccessible to them. They diversified, giving rise to numerous groups such as crocodilians, turtles, lizards, snakes, birds, and mammals. The appearance of the first flowering plants in the history of life on Earth is very difficult to date, as they are difficult to fossilize. Nonetheless, they play an essential role for the plants that bear them, attracting insects for pollen dissemination. Exceptional paleontological deposits have led to the discovery of two extremely well-preserved flowers. The first, Archaefructus, resembles today's water lilies, but its anatomical organization remains unclear. The second, Montsechia, has long, narrow stems. Numerous fruits are found throughout the plant. These primitive flowering plants have little in common with the more classic flowers we know today. Since they first appeared, flowering plants have continued to diversify. Today, there are over 270,000 species in all environments, whether on land or in water. They range in size and shape from orchids to oak trees. By comparison, the fern group comprises 10,000 species, and the pine and associated species group around 750. And yet, these two groups are much older than flowering plants. The latter are therefore a true evolutionary success story. This is perhaps due to the way flowering plants reproduce, enabling them to rapidly colonize all types of environment. Fauna and flora are now well established on land. Although they will suffer disasters over the years, leading to more or less profound modifications, nothing will totally wipe them out. What are the effects of this outflow of water on the Earth? The colonization and establishment of life on the continents caused major changes to planet Earth over hundreds of millions of years. Land plants were the first to colonize the Earth outside water. Their roots contribute to soil formation. They break up rocks, facilitating the concentration of organic matter. Soils are essential for plant growth and have important geological implications, particularly with regard to erosion and land stability. Plant roots help prevent soil erosion by stabilizing the soil. Forests and meadows help to slow the flow of water. Particles transported by watercourses can thus be sedimented. This contributes to the formation of sedimentary rock. Certain living organisms, such as lichens and bacteria, promote the chemical alteration of rocks by releasing organic acids that can dissolve minerals. As a result, rocks disintegrate and soils are formed. Living organisms are mainly made up of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. When they die, organic matter is decomposed by microbial activity. If this happens in an aerobic environment, all the carbon is converted into carbon dioxide, and mineralization is complete. If, on the other hand, this takes place in an anaerobic environment, mineralization stops as soon as all the oxygen initially present has been consumed. Most of the biomass undergoes total mineralization. The remaining 1%, which sediments, is the source of oil, natural gas, and coal. In this way, the accumulation of plant debris in rapidly sedimenting areas during the Carboniferous period created large reserves of carbon that are used today in the form of coal. The weathering of limestone can then be accelerated, leading to the formation of caves. Caves are underground voids of varying sizes. Microbial activity in the soil contributes to the production of carbon dioxide. The appearance of life and its emergence from the waters involve complex interactions between chemical elements, geological processes, and living organisms. This has had a major impact on the establishment and evolution of biogeochemical cycles. These cycles are essential to the regulation of ecosystems and the survival of life on Earth. Biogeochemical cycles are the processes by which elements or chemical compounds are transported or transformed between the major terrestrial reservoirs, the geosphere, atmosphere, and hydrosphere, in which the biosphere is found. Through a series of processes, elements move from one medium to another, returning to their original environment in an infinite recycling loop. Living organisms need a constant and regular supply of essential elements such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur to ensure their survival. Elements circulate continuously from one environment to another, from one form to another. They are found in soil, atmosphere, water, and living tissue. This continuous circulation is known as the biogeochemical cycle. These cycles combine biological, chemical, and geological processes. Biological processes are defined as respiration or digestion. Chemical processes are combustion or synthesis reactions. The latter two take place over relatively short periods of time. Geological processes, on the other hand, occur over much longer timescales and are defined by erosion or sedimentation. The establishment of biogeochemical cycles on Earth is a complex process that has developed over billions of years. These cycles have evolved in response to interactions between chemical elements, geological processes, living organisms, and terrestrial, aquatic, and atmospheric environments. The colonization of land by plants and animals has had a major impact on biogeochemical cycles. Many mechanisms are involved, but let's take a look at the four most important cycles. The carbon cycle. The significant greening of continents apart from the polar and desert regions is a major change in Earth's history. This conquest of land by plants is not without consequences, as terrestrial plants are important players in the carbon cycle. Plants use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to form their own living matter through the process of photosynthesis. In addition, their root cells breathe and release some CO2 into the soil. This creates acidic solutions in their vicinity and encourages the weathering of rocks, which in the long term traps carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The development of terrestrial vegetation also deepens soils by a few centimeters to 1 meter on average. The increase in continental vegetation has reduced the greenhouse effect and cooled the climate. In the long term, dead organic matter accumulates on the soil in the form of plant biomass, helping to form soils rich in organic carbon. This is then buried and transformed into fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, or natural gas. This transformation requires soil carbon sequestration. The nitrogen cycle. The massive arrival of plants on land has also had an impact on the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is the most abundant gas in the atmosphere. Today's air contains 78% of it. This element is essential to the functioning of living organisms, since it is used to make proteins and produce the nitrogenous bases present in DNA. However, it cannot be directly assimilated in its initial form by most living organisms. We must therefore rely on bacteria to transform atmospheric nitrogen into a form that can be assimilated by other organisms. Through its biogeochemical cycle, nitrogen passes from one form to another. Bacteria, such as cyanobacteria and rhizobium, which live in symbiosis with plants, capture atmospheric nitrogen and transform it into ammonia, which is then used directly by plants and animals and reacts with hydrogen to form ammonium. Oxidation reactions then come into play, with some bacteria oxidizing ammonium to form nitrite, while others oxidize nitrite to form nitrate. Transported in soil or water, nitrate and ammonium are captured by plants through their roots. Nitrogen now fixed on plants is available to herbivorous animals and is passed on in the terrestrial food chain. Carnivorous animals ingest nitrogen by feeding on herbivorous animals. Nitrogen is then present in plant and animal waste. Certain fungi and bacteria decompose it and produce ammonia, which dissolves to form ammonium. Certain bacteria, known as denitrifying bacteria, convert nitrate into dinitrogen, returning it directly to the atmosphere. The phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus cycle was greatly disrupted when living organisms colonized dry land. Phosphorus is essential to life. It is a basic material in DNA, bones, shells, and teeth. The phosphorus cycle is sedimentary, meaning that it does not involve atmospheric processes, as it has virtually no gaseous components. The main source of phosphorus is the erosion of sedimentary rocks. Under the action of rain and wind, small quantities of phosphorus escape from the rocks. It is released in the form of dissolved phosphate and enters the food chain, starting with plants. The latter directly assimilate this essential element for their growth. Herbivores then feed on the plants, which are then eaten by carnivores. Phosphates are returned to the soil via animal feces and urine, as well as through the degradation of animals and plants once they have died. However, over time, some phosphorus has been leached from the soil and transported to the oceans, where it has become trapped in marine sediments. Human activities have resulted in additional phosphorus inputs. The mining of these phosphates for fertilizer production has altered the phosphorus cycle, leading to environmental disturbances such as eutrophication of watercourses. Water quality declines, affecting the ecosystem and the aquatic environment. The water cycle. The proliferation of terrestrial vegetation has influenced the water cycle by promoting evapotranspiration. This is the process by which terrestrial liquid water is returned to the atmosphere in gaseous form. This water comes from the sublimation of snow, the evaporation of free water, or water buried in the ground, and also from plant transpiration. How do plants, and trees in particular, transpire? You've probably noticed how nice and cool it is in the heart of a forest when it's hot. A tree actively cools the surrounding air, like a parasol, which simply reflects the sun's rays. A tree combines both actions. To grow, plants need nutrients and CO2, which they absorb and store through photosynthesis. Sap circulates through the tree, transferring mineral salts to the leaves for photosynthesis. Transpiration is the driving force, transporting water and nutrients to the leaves. Sap flows are regulated according to plant needs and climatic conditions. Transpiration takes place in the leaves, at the stomata, and in the lenticels on the bark of trunks and branches. Depending on environmental conditions, stomata may close to avoid excessive water loss. Nevertheless, the quantity of water released by a tree during evapotranspiration is very significant. For an oak tree, this amounts to 1,000 liters of water per day. Evapotranspiration is an essential component of the water cycle. Although it represents only a small part of the overall water cycle, it is fundamental. It transfers water from the soil and vegetation to the atmosphere. At present, urbanization, deforestation, and other practices that make soil impermeable reduce evapotranspiration and alter the water cycle by altering the infiltration of water into the soil. The consequences are flooding, reduced groundwater reserves, and changes in precipitation patterns. Life could not emerge from the water until it had a shield to protect it from the sun's ultraviolet rays. This is the ozone layer. Oxygen is present in 3 forms in the atmosphere. There are oxygen atoms, O, oxygen molecules, O2, which represent the oxygen we breathe, and ozone, O3. Ozone is a molecule made up of 3 oxygen atoms. It is a colorless gas, but has a very strong odor. Ozone is formed in a section of the atmosphere known as the stratosphere. In this region, high-energy solar photons can strike oxygen molecules and separate the 2 oxygen atoms. When a free oxygen atom comes into contact with an oxygen molecule O2, an ozone molecule is formed. Ozone is then naturally degraded in the stratosphere through a series of chemical transformations under the effect of the sun's ultraviolet rays. In an unpolluted atmosphere, ozone production and destruction exactly balance each other out. Its total concentration then remains relatively constant. Ozone naturally accumulates in the stratosphere, but is only present in abundance when there is sufficient oxygen. Scientific research estimates that the first threshold of the ozone layer was formed around 600 million years ago. This first threshold allowed an explosion of life during the Ediacaran period and later during the Cambrian. It was then present at 90% of today's ozone levels. The second threshold was reached around 400 million years ago, coinciding with the emergence of the first animals from the waters. The molecules making up living matter are photosensitive, which means they can be destroyed by certain types of radiation, such as ultraviolet light. Ozone absorbs a large proportion of ultraviolet rays, protecting living organisms from their harmful effects. When the Earth was first formed, it was covered in volcanoes, and the atmosphere consisted mainly of carbon dioxide and methane. There was no oxygen or ozone. In those days, without an ozone layer, the sun's ultraviolet rays reduced all organisms to aquatic and simple single-cell life. Around 600 million years ago, the accumulation of oxygen by cyanobacteria and other oxygen-releasing organisms enabled the atmosphere to reach a first threshold of oxygen, and thus ozone. When the first terrestrial arthropods emerged from the waters around 400 million years ago, the second threshold, equivalent to the present one, was reached. The oxygen produced by living organisms such as plants and the first forests slowly reached the upper layers of the atmosphere, where it was degraded by ultraviolet radiation, giving rise to ozone. Ozone supports the development of life when it is present in the stratosphere. above 15 kilometers or 9 miles in altitude, ozone concentrations peak at around 25 kilometers or 15 miles above sea level. It is precisely this ozone-rich region of the atmosphere that is known as the ozone layer. Moreover, the amount of ozone present at any given point on the Earth's surface varies according to day, season, and latitude. The emergence of life forms from the water represents a quantum leap in the evolution of life on Earth. If this has been possible, it's because life on land has many advantages over life in the water, although this largely depends on the needs and preferences of the organisms in question. Terrestrial organisms have direct access to atmospheric air, which is far more abundant in oxygen than that dissolved in the aquatic environment. This facilitates air breathing. What's more, air is less dense than water. Land-dwelling organisms don't have to fight against buoyancy, allowing for a greater diversity of body shapes and structures. On land, solar energy is harnessed to a greater extent, and body temperature is more easily regulated. Its direct use for photosynthesis is an advantage over aquatic organisms, which receive limited energy from the depths. How did scientists discover that the Earth had undergone ice ages? Evidence of ice ages comes in 3 different forms: geological, chemical, and paleontological. Each of these provides scientists with material to develop a general understanding of the effect of ice ages over the past billions of years. Geological evidence corresponds to the stripping of rocks, the deposition of unconsolidated material, sculpted valleys. Geological evidence has its limits. They can be deformed or erased over time, and it can be difficult to date them accurately. Chemical evidence is defined by variations in the isotope ratios of fossils found in sediment and rock samples. The isotope ratio is the ratio of the number of atoms of 2 isotopes in the same sample. To study the most recent glacial and interglacial periods, scientists use samples of ice cores and ocean sediments. They may also contain air bubbles, enabling analysis of the composition of the atmosphere during the period under study. Finally, paleontological evidence is characterized by changes in the geographical distribution of fossils. Most organisms that live in warm conditions do not survive ice ages, whereas those adapted to colder temperatures are more likely to survive. Thus, a low fossil count in higher latitudes indicates the spread of ice caps. Scientists rely on these 3 types of evidence and on numerous data sources to obtain the most consistent results possible. One of the most valuable sites used as an indicator of ancient climates is the Antarctic ice cap, which has provided information on past atmospheric temperature and composition. Little Dome Sea is a drilling site set at an altitude of over 3,200 meters, or 10,500 feet, above sea level on an East Antarctic plateau. Temperatures regularly drop to minus 50 degrees Celsius or minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The landscape is carpeted in white, and the first coastline lies more than 1,000 kilometers or 620 miles away. Since 2021, scientists have been drilling into the ice cap to extract ice cores 4 meters or 13 feet long. The aim is to reach ice layers at a depth of 2,700 meters or 8,900 feet. The idea is to be able to go back in time 1.5 million years and reveal new information about the climate of the time. 90% of the world's ice is concentrated in Antarctica. Antarctica covers an area of 14 million square kilometers. This gigantic white continent is an invaluable archive of the Earth's history. Its ice, thousands of meters thick, contains information on its temperature and the composition of its atmosphere. Scientists are as interested in the ice itself as in the air bubbles trapped inside it. The latter reveal the concentration of various greenhouse gases, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Drilling has enabled us to go back a long way in time. What is the origin of these climate changes? Various causes are responsible for the appearance of ice ages. Some of them are interdependent. The Earth's orbit around the Sun undergoes cyclical variations over time, known as Milankovitch cycles. During these periods, the Earth's distance from the Sun and its inclination will change, resulting in a redistribution of the sunlight received. The movement of tectonic plates influences the glaciations that the Earth undergoes. Depending on the position of the continents, the flow of warm water towards the poles can be disrupted or blocked, leading to the formation of ice caps. Variations in the amount of continental and oceanic crust affect winds and ocean currents. Atmospheric composition, such as carbon dioxide and methane concentrations, is linked to ice cap movements. Greenhouse gas levels decrease with their advance and increase with their retreat. Let's take a look at the 5 major ice ages in Earth's history. $2.4 billion years ago, the Earth experienced its first ice age, which was also one of the longest in its history. This was the Huronian glaciation. This glaciation began 2.4 billion years ago and lasted until minus 2.1 billion years during the Paleoproterozoic era. The oceans occupy almost 25% more than their present volume, due to the degassing of the Earth's mantle. Lava from volcanic sites is rich in potassium and phosphorus, making it a high-quality fertilizer. Due to wind and weather, lava naturally breaks up and crumbles. Small pieces of material embed themselves in the fractures of the magmatic rocks and accumulate there in large numbers. As the rocks are porous, they retain not only moisture, but also a warm temperature ideal for the development of life. In the end, these seemingly inhospitable places were the scene of the development of the first organisms. Among these microbes carried by wind, weather, or tides are cyanobacteria, a type of prokaryotic bacteria with no nucleus. These unicellular organisms can live both in water and on land, in large colonies. Their metabolism is based on photosynthesis. They produce oxygen. Cyanobacteria in the air transform nitrogen into ammonium and nitrate, while those in the oceans trap carbon and produce the limestone of stromatolites. The combination of lava fragments and cyanobacterial growth gradually forms soil. Then, little by little in these same privileged environments, more complex organisms such as mosses and fungi appear. The latter will develop a method of rooting, in particular, mycenes. It was thanks in part to them that life first walked the Earth, since by breaking rocks they enabled the first terrestrial settlements. It was only later, that pollen also contributed to the proliferation of life. The Earth is not yet very conducive to the development of more complex forms of life. It is covered with active volcanoes, and toxic clouds are permanently present. Vast expanses of lava cover the ground as the sun floods in its deadly ultraviolet rays. Although cyanobacteria remain in the water, the flora is still widely dispersed. Nevertheless, a major event occurred 2.4 billion years ago that changed the face of life. It was the Great Oxidation. At that time, oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere was scarce. It remained trapped in minerals or enclosed in water. The Great Oxidation affects the Earth's waters, biosphere, and atmosphere. It can be seen as a catastrophe or an opportunity for life on Earth. Most organisms are anaerobic, but cyanobacteria are beginning to develop oxygenated photosynthesis. They occupy a new ecological niche and reproduce very rapidly by harnessing the sun's energy. Photosynthesis produces a waste product, oxygen, which cyanobacteria expel into the air. Initially, this oxygen is absorbed by the oxidation of surface iron, but as the number of cyanobacteria increases, the oxygen sinks, becomes saturated. This accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere has had devastating consequences for anaerobic organisms, which cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. Oxygen is a highly reactive element that can disrupt the metabolic processes of anaerobic organisms by forming free radicals. These unstable molecules can damage proteins, nucleic acids, and cell membranes, leading to cell death. As a result, many of these organisms have been eliminated, leading to a mass extinction of anaerobic organisms. But increased oxygen levels have paved the way for the evolution of new life forms better adapted to these conditions. Oxygen enables much more efficient cellular respiration than other forms of energy metabolism. In other words, organisms capable of aerobic respiration can produce far more energy from a given quantity of nutrients than their anaerobic counterparts. Some organisms have evolved to use oxygen as the final electron acceptor in their electron transport chains, thereby greatly increasing the efficiency of ATP production, which could be described as the cell's energy currency. In addition, antioxidant enzymes such as superoxide, dismutase, or catalyses have evolved to neutralize toxic free radicals produced by reactions with oxygen, enabling these organisms to survive and thrive in an oxygen-rich environment. In order to survive, aerobic organisms have learned to use oxygen to breathe, eliminating the free radicals that can oxidize molecules and damage their bodies. This evolution was made possible by 3 new amino acids integrated into their genome: methionine, tryptophan, and selenocysteine. Since then, all aerobic organisms have learned to survive in the presence of oxygen, provided it remains at normal concentrations. If it exceeds these concentrations, oxygen remains unconditionally poisonous. Although this change of atmosphere was fatal to most life forms of the time, new organisms were emerging in the form of eukaryotes and metazoans. Eukaryotes include all organisms, whether unicellular or multicellular, as long as they contain a nucleus and organelles specialized for respiration. Today, eukaryotes encompass three major kingdoms of the living world: plants, fungi, and animals. The second group of organisms to develop is the metazoans. They are multicellular, consisting of a nucleus and organelles, and feed on organic matter. Their cells form tissues. The atmosphere is totally destabilized. Microorganisms have consumed most of the nutrients they needed to form oxygen. But there was another consequence for the climate. During this great oxygenation event, atmospheric oxygen increased considerably, thereby reducing methane. Oxygen combines with methane to form carbon dioxide and water. The latter do not retain heat as well as methane. At the same time, a mass extinction occurred for the majority of life forms, which were then anaerobic. For them, oxygen was toxic. At the same time, volcanic activity slowed for 250 million years. These events combined to produce less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, resulting in a greatly reduced greenhouse effect. Temperatures fell, and the planet entered an ice age. For the first time, the Earth's surface would have been entirely covered in ice. This abrupt change in climate is linked to the transformation of the atmosphere that occurred with the evolution of life. Photosynthesis processes carried out by prokaryotic bacteria released oxygen. At the same time, the limestone that forms traps CO2, considerably reducing its quantity in the atmosphere. The reduction in greenhouse gas emissions led to a drop in the Earth's temperature. At that time, the sun provided only 85% of the energy it does today. Temperatures reached as low as -50 degrees Celsius or -58 degrees Fahrenheit for tens of thousands of years. The water present at the time becomes ice. Albedo increases, accentuating cooling and freeze-up. For millions of years, the Earth resembled an enormous ball of ice, with a surface temperature of -10 degrees Celsius or 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists believe that this Huronian ice age brought photosynthesis to a virtual standstill. The Huronian glaciation occurred at a very early time in the Earth's history, long before the existence of dinosaurs or most of the life forms we know today. Its probable consequences have been erased by the billions of years of geological evolution that followed. The evidence of this period has been overturned by subsequent geological changes. Nevertheless, scientists have been able to trace the formation of vast glacial deposits. These accumulated in the form of sedimentary rocks, principally tillites, formed by the compaction of continental sediments containing material carried by glaciers, and lamanites. Glacial activity modifies the landscape, forming lakes and valleys. Such a drop in temperature must also have altered ocean circulation and atmospheric composition. Glaciation also had a geochemical influence, modifying the cycle of elements such as iron and oxygen in the oceans. Finally, this change in climate imposed difficult survival conditions on the life forms that remained at the time, and this certainly had an impact on their evolution, as well as on future life forms. And yet, life survives the cold. In principle, below the freezing point of water, the metabolic functions of organisms are interrupted. As water crystallizes, it invades the cytoplasm in organisms. Cell tissues are destroyed, and the organism dies. Yet microbial life can persist in such a seemingly hostile environment, and the return to life following the ice ages is proof of this. When imprisoned in ice, some microbes continue to metabolize at a much lower rate than normal, depending on the temperature and quantity of food available. Others suspend all energy consumption or form spores to survive in the absence of energy. As conditions improve, mechanisms are put in place to repair cellular damage. Microbial life faced with starvation will react in different ways. Some organisms will suffer, while others will react in different ways. They may develop ultra-microcells, synthesize stress proteins, or express starvation genes to become more resistant. Another solution is to reduce metabolism and become dormant, or to form spores. Cold shock and falling temperatures also place different demands on microbes. They will develop methods to counter the loss of membrane fluidity, the reduced rate of enzymatic processes, and cell damage. Ice subjected to extremely low temperatures, such as during glaciations, displays unusual properties. Liquid veins can be found. These are insoluble impurities in the crystalline structure that concentrate in the liquid phase and form a vein-like network, measuring just a few micrometers. These famous veins contain liquid water, nutrients, and biomolecules, a veritable oasis for the metabolism of the microorganisms trapped there. However, microbes must be able to tolerate a pH as low as 0 if they are to benefit from the energy present in acidic ice veins. The acidophiles most frequently found in liquid veins are eukaryotic cells, bacteria, and archaea. There is also a surface of mineral grains dragged along by the ice, which develops a thin film of water that remains in a liquid state. This allows microorganisms to extract nutrients and the energy they need. They will have to adapt to keep their cytoplasm fluid, even when confronted with a temperature of -50 degrees Celsius or 58 degrees Fahrenheit. Despite the catastrophic situation that befell the Earth during the Ice Age, its heart continues to be active. The CO2 emitted by volcanoes accumulates under the ice and is suddenly released into the atmosphere, reinforcing the greenhouse effect and raising surface temperatures. Deglaciation then takes place in just a few tens of thousands of years. Volcanoes have also helped preserve life. They have kept certain areas out of the ice. Thanks to them, many species have been able to survive episodes of glaciation. As soon as the climate becomes milder again, species gradually colonize the regions surrounding these geothermal refuges. Studies carried out in the vicinity of these geothermal zones have shown a richness of biodiversity that diminishes with distance. Hundreds of millions of years have passed since the Huronian glaciation. The Earth has since been rebuilt. 800 million years ago, it consisted of a single vast continent, Rodinia, surrounded by a gigantic ocean, Merovia. At that time, the average temperature was 10.5 degrees Celsius, or 51 degrees Fahrenheit, and the young sun emitted 6% less light than it does today. The day lasted less than 22 hours, and the year comprised 13 months. Present-day North America forms the heart of Rodinia. Australia lies at our latitudes and Antarctica almost at the equator. As a result of magmatic movements and volcanic activity, Rodinia began to fragment around 750 million years ago. Initially, it split into two blocks, in the middle of which a new ocean, Panthalassa, the ancestor of the Pacific Ocean, was born. The part that today represents North America heads towards the ice-covered South Pole. The land in the northern half of Rodinia heads towards the North Pole. Between the two halves lies the Congo Craton. This is a hard, stable zone that was once consolidated to the lithosphere. A few million years later, these three parts will come together again to form a new supercontinent called Pannotia. The collisions associated with this future meeting will give rise to mountains, the Pan-African orogeny. At this time, the mid-oceanic ripples are not very active, and average temperatures are falling. During the Varanger glaciation, the Earth actually underwent two glacial episodes. The first, known as the Sturtian glaciation, began 720 million years ago and ended 660 million years ago. Over the next 10 million years, temperatures rose again, forming an interglacial period. The second glacial episode, known as the Merino glaciation, occurred between 650 and 630 million years ago. These periods of severe glaciation are recognized as the most severe in Earth's history. Since the last ice age, the Earth has seen a resurgence in the diversity of life. There are new types of algae, such as chromophytes, an evolutionary-grade grouping organisms with chlorophyll, but also haptophytes, a division of unicellular algae characterized by the presence of a particular extremity called a haptonym, or dinoflagellates, a class of highly diversified, unicellular aquatic eukaryotic organisms. There are also hyphae, the filaments that make up mycelium and fungal spores. However, no traces of animals such as hydras or sponges have been found during this period. The parts of ancient Rodinia that reach the poles are not warm. Vast expanses of ice take shape. Soils and oceans freeze over hundreds of meters. Polar caps reach the equator. A feedback loop begins as ice reflects more of the sun's rays than darker oceans. The entire planet freezes over. Temperatures plunge to minus 50 degrees Celsius, and the thickness of ocean ice reaches over a kilometer. The Earth literally becomes a snowball. The distribution of carbon undergoes profound changes, leading to a reduction in oceanic organic productivity. Photosynthesis is halted for millions of years. Runoff water is no longer an agent of erosion. The atmosphere on Earth is distressing. The sun, although present, shines less brightly. The air is dry, cold, and unbreathable. Snowfall is rare, but powerful winds bring a little dynamism to this desolate land. No liquid water circulates. The situation seems catastrophic for life, and yet, at the bottom of the ocean, life persists in the form of algae and bacteria. And not only does it persist, but multicellular organisms also took off just after this ice age. How was this possible when everything seems so unfavorable to the concentration of nutrients and oxygen needed to sustain life? Scientists have carried out computer simulations to reproduce the snowball effect with an equivalent rate of glaciation. It appears that near the equator there are still refuge zones where the ocean would not have frozen. This is how, extremophilic organisms were able to isolate themselves in a closed environment. In the end, evolution continued and even accelerated. Microbial life could even survive and develop in solid ice. Glaciers would have played a local role in oxygenating the oceans. Certain metals, such as iron and manganese, were overrepresented in oxidized forms, testifying to a significant local supply of oxygen. The farther away from the grounding line, the rarer the oxidized forms. The grounding line is the zone between the part where the ice floats and the part where it rests on land. During this ice age, the grounding line may well have been a veritable Eden filled with oxygen. This oxygen came from small air bubbles enclosed in the compacted snow that formed the glaciers. At the grounding lines, these bubbles were released into the liquid ocean as the ice melted and rubbed against the rough bedrock. Even as the ice descends to the equator, volcanism continues, and CO2 and methane are constantly being emitted into the atmosphere. Once the concentration of carbon dioxide reaches 350 times today's level, the greenhouse effect becomes sufficient to reverse the glacial situation and melt the ice. Life can resume. Work carried out by Noah Planavsky in the United States reveals that the erosion of continents during the melting of the ice released large quantities of phosphorus. Its high presence in the ocean would have contributed to the proliferation of phytoplankton and consequently the release of oxygen into the atmosphere. 1 million years, that's how long it would take for the thick mantle of ice covering the planet to melt. As a result, large volumes of calcareous deposits are formed, overlaying the deposits of the Varanger era. Over the following millions of years, the first, more complex animals appeared. The surviving cyanobacteria resumed their photosynthesis process, releasing oxygen in mass. The air changed, the microbial fauna diversified, and new life forms appeared. These are known as the Ediacara fauna. These primitive, soft-bodied animals, though still very simple compared with today's animals, are a great step forward in the world of animal life. They live mainly on the seafloor and have tough integuments that allow them to be fossilized. Most of these animals are flat. Dickinsonia holds the record, with a thickness of just 5 millimeters for a size that can reach over 1 meter or 3 feet. This facilitated tissue oxygenation without the need for organs to transport dissolved gases. Dickinsonia is a ribbed oval-shaped specimen with no mouth, anus, or digestive system. It consumes the bacterial films lining the seabed. The various organisms in the Ediacara fauna resemble jellyfish, arthropods, or leaf-like forms. Some resemble nothing known today. Most of the fossils found at this time do not fit easily into today's phyla. Cells, which until then had reproduced by dividing, were now able to stick together, thanks to a protein called collagen to form the first multicellular animals. The latter are reduced to their simplest expression, i.e., a simple cluster of cells brought together for the benefits they all derive from it. There are no nervous, vascular, or digestive systems as yet. The sponge is the oldest animal known to have come into existence. Today, this living fossil numbers some 10,000 species. The sponge's body is soft and pierced by numerous tiny holes called pores. It is through these pores that the water passes and is filtered to extract the nutrients the sponge needs. the body is supported by a skeleton composed of limestone or silicon. Sponges have an extraordinary capacity for regeneration. Once a part has been removed, it grows back without being damaged. Sponges have a very wide distribution, having colonized both fresh and brackish marine waters to depths of over 5,000 meters or 16,400 feet, as well as shallow waters, regardless of climate. After a period of calm, the climate became capricious again, and a new glaciation occurred during the Upper Ordovician and Silurian periods, around 460 to 420 million years ago. During the Ordovician period, which began 485 million years ago, the continents were grouped together to form the supercontinent Gondwana. This was formed by the fracturing of Rodinia. The history of our planet is punctuated by the merging and separation of its land masses under the effect of plate tectonics, and the continents never stop moving. While Gondwana settles at the South Pole, 3 other smaller continents, Laurentia, Siberia, and Baltica, and their islands head north to find a warm home near the equator. Here they experience the vagaries of a tropical climate, a hot sun and violent rainfall. The rain that falls from the sky carries with it carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Combined with the heat, the rocks are dissolved. Carbon-containing ions are released and carried by runoff into the oceans. Marine animals use them to build their shells and skeletons. When they die, the carbonate material is stored in sediments on the seabed. In the long term, the process of taking carbon from the atmosphere and burying it on the ocean floor considerably reduces the amount of atmospheric CO2. The CO2 released by erupting volcanoes is not enough to compensate for these losses. The greenhouse effect diminishes, and temperatures on Earth begin to fall too. This ice age is not, however, an icy one. We're not talking about a snowball Earth here. It's even likely that in its early stages, it contributed to the development of biodiversity. During this period, the number of marine animal genera increased, known as the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBE. The rapid diversification of plankton favors the development of fauna living on the ocean floor. Cambrian trilobites, inarticulate brachiopods, and eucrinoids gave way to cephalopods, crinoids, and articulate brachiopods. Continental seas are shallow and rich in life, and the first coral reefs appear. Mollusks become common, especially bivalves, gastropods, and nautiloids. Corals appear, colonizing the oceans and building immense reefs like veritable ecosystems. They helped enrich the marine fauna. By the end of the Ordovician period, the oceans were teeming with species, each more diverse and varied than the last. From starfish and sponges to sea scorpions and other extraordinary species of clumsily swimming primitive fish. It was also at this time that the first large predators appeared. Until then, animals had been almost exclusively benthic, staying close to the seabed, but orthocerid cephalopods were the first to swim in open water. Trilobites had better watch out, because the terror of the seas is approaching. Here we see a Camaraceris. Sporting a straight cone several meters long, it has tentacles that it can wave from all sides. Its bulging eyes enable it to spot its prey in search of its next meal. With a single stroke of the beak, the carapace of a trilobite breaks in two. From now on, the entire food web becomes more complex. Biodiversity may appreciate the drop in temperature compared with the Cambrian, but it will have trouble coping with the next challenge. The Andes-Saharan glaciation contributed to one of the 5 greatest mass extinctions in Earth's history, known as the Ordovician-Silurian extinction. Following this extinction, 70% of species disappeared from the Earth's surface. But what was the origin of this glaciation? Far away, several thousand light years from Earth, a star exploded in a supernova. The gigantic burst of energy releases gamma rays that reach the Earth at the speed of light. These rays penetrate the atmosphere, altering the ozone layer and darkening the planet. Nitrogen and oxygen are transformed into the toxic gas nitrogen dioxide. The latter engulfs the planet to the point of blocking the passage of sunlight. This theory has little support in the scientific community, as the main obstacle to its acceptance is the difficulty of proving it, as traces of the supernova have long since disappeared. But another cause could have had an impact on the climate of the time. Although solar luminosity was around 4.5% less intense than today during the late Ordovician period, a decrease which under today's climatic conditions would lead to glaciation, the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide was considerably higher, reaching levels up to 18 times higher than today. This high CO2 concentration would normally have exerted a powerful greenhouse effect, counterbalancing the lower solar luminosity. Parallel to these factors, the Appalachian orogeny was underway, a geological process that spanned approximately 325 to 260 million years. This phenomenon was the result of the subduction of the oceanic tectonic plate beneath the North American continental plate. This geological process contributed to a massive reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels. The explanation lies in the silicate weathering mechanism, a chemical reaction accelerated by the newly formed mountains, which captures carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stores it in the Earth's crust. In addition, tectonic plate movements have led to significant changes in the distribution of continents, which may have influenced ocean and atmospheric currents, thus modifying the climate. To this we can add the Earth's orbital variations, which also have the potential to influence climate by altering the incidence of solar radiation on the Earth's surface. Whatever the cause, glaciation is underway. As ice accumulates on the continent, sea levels drop. Shallow marine areas are reduced. The first links in the food chain are affected, resulting in famine for all organisms. What was once an ocean teeming with life is totally devastated. In just over 500 years, a third of the existing fauna had disappeared. Another 100,000 years later, the famine continues. Glaciers sucked water from the ocean. Shoals are drained, drying up. The sea retreats several hundred meters, but once again life will prevail. Beyond a certain depth, organisms can find refuge. Nautiloids and eurypterids seek shelter on the seabed. Other animals adapt to cold water. Such is the case of the Astrapus. This small primitive fish of the ostracoderm family, barely larger than a hand, has no fins and moves with the back of its body. To feed, it sucks up small invertebrates living on the seabed or the debris of dead animals. Its skin is highly sensitive to vibrations, enabling it to escape the predators of the time. Astrapus was the first to feature a primitive backbone. This creature, relatively insignificant at first glance, is in fact the first known vertebrate fish. This lineage would later give rise to birds, reptiles, and mammals. Astrapus proved particularly resistant to this new ice age. It follows the retreating ocean. It is a picky eater, feeding on whatever it can find. It also tolerates cold water better than other aquatic creatures. The Astrapus adapts to this new ordeal, and soon a new variety of fish is born. These were equipped with the first gills, enabling them to absorb food more easily. It would be another 500,000 years before the planet began to warm up. At last, the glaciers melted. But for the species that had managed to survive the Ice Age, it was a new climatic upheaval. The toll was heavy. Over 70% of species disappeared forever. Thanks to nature's formidable resilience, life will resume and write a new chapter in the history of the Earth. The oceans will be repopulated by astonishing species, and the planet will gradually return to its tropical climate until the next ice age, which began in the Carboniferous period around 320 million years ago. We're in the Devonian over 400 million years ago. This was a pivotal period for vertebrates, but also for vegetation. The Earth is still mostly covered by the immense Panthalassa Ocean. Proto-Gondwana slowly slides northwards. It is set to collide with the young continent of Laurasia, formed a few million years earlier. These two continental blocks would unite at the start of the next period, the Carboniferous, to form a single continent, Pangea. At this time, the ice caps were absent, and the Earth enjoyed a relatively mild climate, around 25 degrees Celsius, or 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The weather was warm and vegetation thrived and conquered terra firma. The first terrestrial plants, characterized by lichens and mosses, appeared around 500 million years ago. Over millions of years, creeping plants evolved into ferns and lycopods, until during the Carboniferous period, over 350 million years ago, for the first time in Earth's history, they became rich and abundant vegetation. Thanks to warm, humid temperatures, the first insects proliferated. For the time being, they are the only terrestrial inhabitants. There are currently no herbivores. As a result, plants are literally colonizing the Earth. The first forests formed, vegetation diversified and became abundant. Large tree ferns grow alongside lycopods a few meters high. The first broad-leaved plants appear. Thanks to photosynthesis and the resulting oxygen, the Earth's atmosphere is enriched with oxygen, which will not be without consequences. Indeed, the rise in oxygen levels combined with high atmospheric pressure favored the most energy-intensive metabolisms, and large terrestrial vertebrates grew to titanic proportions. One of the best-known examples is the dragonfly, Meganeura, with a wingspan of up to 75 centimeters or 30 inches. There's also the Arthropods, a distant ancestor of millipedes, which measured up to 1.8 meters or 6 feet in length. Rising oxygen levels also led vegetation to become more resistant to fire. It was also at this time that flowering plants appeared. Increased plant development leads to the absorption of large quantities of atmospheric CO2, which considerably reduces the greenhouse effect. Lignin and cellulose from tree trunks and plant debris accumulate. A polar climate process is triggered. Summers are now too cold for winter snow to melt. The snow accumulates and creates sufficient pressure to form ice. Albedo rises as the ice sheet, an ice sheet covering the mainland, expands. A feedback loop is triggered, and the ice extends further and further. Under the effect of this climate change, plants are forced to slow down their evolution. The high oxygen level triggers fires despite the prevailing humidity. The combination of slower vegetation growth and the occurrence of fires causes a further increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, preventing a snowball effect through greenhouse warming. Over the years, the drop in albedo leads to warmer summers and milder winters, limiting snow depth in areas where glaciers grow. The melting of ice caused by global warming leads to a rise in sea level, which now covers the anoxic zones that used to trap carbon. The Earth now has less surface area to sequester carbon, and a greater proportion of carbon dioxide returns to the atmosphere. The Karoo glaciation came to an end 260 million years ago, bringing the Earth's atmospheric oxygen levels close to those of today. Since then, there has been no ice age until the one we're currently in, the Pliocene Quaternary, which began around 2.58 million years ago. At the end of the Pliocene, today we are in the last Great Ice Age. It began during the Upper Pliocene some 2.58 million years ago. We are currently experiencing an interglacial period, which is reflected in the retreat of glaciers accompanied by global warming. The current ice age is known as the Pliocene Quaternary glaciation. Since its beginnings, the Earth has undergone several glacial and interglacial periods. Ice caps advance and retreat on timescales ranging from 40,000 to 100,000 years. In the past, they covered the entire globe. Today, they are limited to Greenland, Antarctica, and a few smaller glaciers, such as the one covering Baffin Island. $2.58 million years ago, the continents were roughly as they are today. Scientists estimate that they have not moved more than 100 kilometers or 62 miles in relation to each other since the beginning of this period. During the previous period, the main change was the connection between North and South America. As a result, the Isthmus of Panama is formed, causing the disappearance of warm equatorial currents and the onset of an Atlantic cooling cycle. The climate gradually became drier and colder. The Greenland ice sheet appears, while the Antarctic ice sheet thickens. The collision between the African plate and Europe continues. The Alps continue to orogenize. Combined with tectonic movement, erosion phenomena, and the trapping of atmospheric CO2 in the form of carbonates continue, reducing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. These phenomena are leading to global climate change. Tropical forests are shrinking, with only a small portion remaining around the equator. Savannas and grasses are now conquering every continent. Temperate forests of deciduous trees are found at mid-latitudes, and conifers and tundra at high latitudes. Antarctica is a veritable frozen desert. The marine and terrestrial faunas, although primitive, are now modern. The junction of North and South America and the formation of the Isthmus of Panama have brought about a great deal of inter-American exchange. A wide variety of animals can now migrate from south to north and from north to south. Mammals, reptiles, amphibians, arthropods, and even flightless birds. Mammals represented by rodents, mastodons, and opossums are widespread in North America. We also find Gomphotherium, a now extinct species closely resembling today's elephants. It has 4 almost upright tusks and a short, tapir-like proboscis that falls back on the lower jaw. Sloths, glyptodons, and armadillos migrate northwards across the Isthmus of Panama. Carnivores diversify. They include dogs, bears, and canids. In Eurasia, while the presence of primates diminishes, rodents are widespread. Giant rodent species roam the planet's surface. A giant rodent fossil, Joseph-Fortigacea monesi, was discovered on a beach in Uruguay in 1987. It appears to be the largest and heaviest rodent known today. Its closest relative today is the pacarana, a rodent that weighs between 10 and 15 kilograms, or 20 and 35 pounds, and lives in the tropical rainforests of the Andes. Joseph-Fortigacea monesi, on the other hand, measures up to 3 meters or 10 feet in length and weighs up to a ton. His skull alone measures 57 centimeters or 23 inches. In comparison, it's as tall as a bison. Its morphology is similar to that of a guinea pig, but proportionally the size of a hippopotamus. Its jaw is exceptionally strong. In Africa, primates continue to evolve, and ungulates dominate. It was also at this time that the first humans and giraffes appeared. The number of bovid species increases. For the first time since the Cretaceous, and thanks to the great Inter-American exchange, North American species mix with those of the South. Marsupials remain dominant in Australia. Wombats and kangaroos appear. Platypuses appear. As the climate changes, tropical flora is replaced by subtropical forests and grasslands. Western Europe was enriched with trees from the birch, oak, and ash families, as well as conifers further north. But the Earth is affected by a gradual cooling, and vertebrates are not indifferent. Evolution continues, but it's getting poorer. Perissodactyl ungulates decline. Conversely, the large artiodactyl ungulates fared much better, as they were satisfied with a coarse diet and better able to withstand periods of food shortage. Mastodons, these gigantic herbivorous mammals, proliferated, and the first elephants appeared. All these giants were an important source of food, and new larger carnivorous mammals appeared. Most of the fauna that reigned at the end of the Pliocene no longer exists today. The ice ages of the next few thousand years took their toll on many of these animals. Some were able to migrate to milder latitudes, while others were doomed to extinction. Even if winters were no harsher than today, the difference lay in the fact that summer no longer existed. The exact number of glaciations during this period is open to debate. 4 major glaciations have been clearly identified, separated by interglacial periods. These were the Gunns Glaciation from 760,000 to 530,000 years ago, the Mindell Glaciation from 650,000 to 350,000 years ago, the Riss Glaciation from 300,000 to 120,000 years ago, and the Würm Glaciation from 80,000 to 10,000 years ago. An important detail in the history of the Earth differentiates this ice age from the others. Man is now at the heart of the glaciations. In fact, it was thanks to these ice ages that the great human adventure began. Climate change means lower sea levels. Far from being a tragedy for mankind, this is actually a door opening for our ancestors from the African continent, Homo erectus, to travel north. In Europe, the cold sets in a little more each winter. Forests wither for lack of water. Oak forests give way to cold, arid steppes. The herds of animals that still roam the plains in search of moss and lichen are a godsend for the human tribes living in Europe. With their rudimentary tools, they catch the young animals and take the adult ones that have already died. As the years go by, the extreme cold sets in, with temperatures dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius or minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Glaciers extend as far as Scotland and the northern Netherlands. The tribes of men, who may have ventured out before, return down in search of warmer lands and temperatures. At this time, fire still eluded them. Ice caps more than 3,000 meters or 10,000 feet thick cover Greenland, North America, and Siberia. All the water used to form these glaciers has caused sea levels to drop by 100 meters. New lands are revealed. The men who populate the African continent now have new prospects. Europe and its herds of reindeer were all the more attractive as the tropical forests had not withstood the heat, and savanna and desert now decorated the landscape. This glaciation lasted for around 80,000 years until an interglacial era began, with the climate warming for around 20,000 years. This cycle has been repeated 4 times to date. It has to be said that the most common state of our planet over the last few million years has been glaciation. In the midst of these glaciations, man has been able to adapt. He protected himself against the cold. Glaciations opened up passages in the sea, and man has continued to travel through glaciations and deglaciations. The event that forever changed its relationship with the climate was the domestication of fire 400,000 years ago. From then on, it penetrated cold regions. They could now set up camp, build shelters and cabins. They can live on permanently frozen ground, their means of heating eternally at hand. After an ice age lasting over 90,000 years, the last great deglaciation began 21,500 years ago and lasted around 10,000 years. At the end of this period, the Earth underwent profound changes. Its average temperature rose by around 4 degrees. The gigantic ice caps that once covered a large part of the North, as far north as Belgium in Europe, melted. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Flora was radically transformed, and the global water cycle intensified. Over 20,000 years ago, the Earth's climate was stable. Atmospheric CO2 levels were relatively low. It was cold, and the oceans were much lower than they are today. 19,000 years ago, a tiny area in the north began to warm up, while the south remained cold and hardly changed at all. CO2 is still low, and the ice caps are not moving. This evolution of the north is undoubtedly due to orbital changes that brought the Earth closer to the sun in summer, while the south was plunged into shadow. The continents are concentrated in the north at high latitudes. This is where the ice caps were formed. Even the slightest warming, of the order of a fraction of a degree, is enough to cause a large volume of ice to melt. Fresh water then flows into the Atlantic. The Atlantic is like an ocean corridor, linking the 2 poles. It carries warm water from the intertropical Atlantic far northwards. Once in the polar zone, this water loses its heat to the atmosphere. It becomes denser and sinks to the depths before flowing southwards. This circulation brings heat from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere. However, if an influx of lighter fresh water occurs in the North Atlantic, the heat in the south may have accumulated as the north cooled. This phenomenon may explain why, 17,500 years ago, the situation shifted. Temperatures in the south rose and the north cooled. Atmospheric CO2 levels rise slowly. After 1,500 years, temperatures in the north also start to rise again, along with the amount of atmospheric CO2. This time, 16,000 years ago, warming affected all latitudes and zones. Atmospheric CO2 levels rose at a faster rate. According to scientific research, warming in the southern hemisphere caused massive degassing of the Southern Ocean, releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide. By 10,000 years ago, warming had reached its definitive value. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels stabilized. Over the next 4,000 years, the ice caps will retreat. This scenario could foreshadow the future of our planet if it is subjected to another episode of massive warming. In just 3 centuries, human activity has produced and released into the atmosphere 30% more carbon dioxide than during the last deglaciation, which lasted 10,000 years. For just over 10,000 years, the Earth has been in an interglacial period, characterized as a warm period known as the Holocene. Melting glaciers caused sea levels to rise to their present levels 6,000 years ago. It was at this time that the Black Sea began to fill up. The ice sheets gradually melted, and the land that had been hidden beneath them was freed from the ice and brought to the surface. Temperate fauna and flora reclaimed the middle and high latitudes. As for those that were adapted to the cold climate, they occupy other ecological niches. The rise in temperature during this interglacial period is not without consequences. In tropical zones, rainfall increases, leading to the shrinking of deserts. Rising sea levels isolate the British Isles from the European continent, moving habitable areas northwards. While flora and fauna have not changed significantly, the distribution of species has. Herds of large herbivores left the tropics as they became invaded by vast expanses of forest. They are now interested in the savannas that have appeared in the northern and southern deserts. In the northern hemisphere and Australia, megafauna are becoming less and less present. Large mammals are affected by a wave of extinction. The disappearance of mammoths and other large herbivores has had an impact on the climate. When these animals were present 12,000 years ago, they emitted 9.6 million tons of methane per year. As they disappeared, atmospheric methane levels fell, and so did the greenhouse effect, causing the planet to cool. The mammoth was a remarkable animal. Closely resembling today's elephants, it had a large head with a trunk, and a massive body with 4 pillared limbs. The largest species reached between 6 and 8 tons. Throughout their evolution, they adapted to ice ages and cold waves. The size of their ears and tails has diminished considerably. The hair, most exposed to thermal shock, could reach a meter in length. Their wool was 6 times thicker than a human hair. Their highly developed sinuses enabled them to process immense quantities of cold air. Their prominent tusks could reach up to 5 meters or 16 feet, an ideal tool for flushing out grass buried under the snow. Mammoths aren't the only ones affected by the extinction wave. In Australia, large species of reptiles and marsupials are disappearing. In North America, megafauna are not spared either. Mastodons, relatives of mammoths and elephants, are suddenly disappearing. The great land sloths, which grew to the size of cows, did not survive. In the family of large carnivores, the American cheetah, the saber-toothed tiger, and the American lion are no more. Giant armadillos, giant bears, and giant beavers have also disappeared. Man's favorite game, the herbivorous wood-eating mammals such as the antelope, are also disappearing from North America. This megafauna has a long lifespan, a low mortality rate, and a slow population increase. Few predators are capable of attacking their adult specimens. Nevertheless, megafauna are highly vulnerable to climate change. The arrival and spread of early man coincided with the beginning of the extinction wave. The mammoth is an animal that provides mankind with everything it needs: ivory for tools, bones for building huts, fur for covering up and protecting itself from the cold, meat as food, and even grease to keep the fire burning. Man has therefore not hesitated to overhunt this giant of history, contributing to its disappearance. But man and hunting were not the only factors behind the mammoth's disappearance. Mammoths were extremely well adapted to the cold. Global warming during the Holocene caused the evolution of grass and shrub-filled steppes into coniferous forests and tundra regions. Although herbivorous, the mammoth's dentition was probably not equipped to consume tree foliage. Some species, such as the woolly mammoth with its thick fur that kept it warm even in freezing climates, could have died out from hypothermia, while others, such as the bison, have adapted to climate change. The increase in temperature on Earth has not been sustainable for them. Ever since the discovery of the ice ages in the 18th century, mankind has been wondering whether an ice age might return. The Earth is currently in an interglacial period. The periodic and alternating nature of glacial and interglacial periods is now well established, as is the inevitable return of the ice ages. Since its very beginnings, the Earth's climate has been influenced by greenhouse gases and astronomical forcing. The latter is due to the slow changes in the inclination of the Earth's axis and the shape of its orbit. Glaciations in the Northern Hemisphere during the Quaternary era are punctuated by variations in obliquity. The first ice ages, between 3 and 1 million years ago, occurred in regular cycles every 41,000 years. Over the last million years, the periodicity has increased to 100,000 years. The ice caps go from deglaciation to glaciation when astronomical forcing crosses a critical threshold, and vice versa. 420,000 years ago, the interglacial period lasted almost 30,000 years instead of the usual 10,000, because astronomical variations were not strong enough to reverse the system. The Earth is still in this situation today, and it is possible that the interglacial period we are currently in will persist naturally for another 50,000 years if the carbon cycle remains undisturbed. The study of the carbon cycle on the scale of the last century has enabled us to better understand how it works. One of the theories put forward is the hypothesis of a return to the initial natural state thanks to the erosion of silicate rocks, which make up a large part of the Earth's crust. Erosion increases in hot, humid climates. Erosion consumes CO2, transforming it into basic carbon. As a result, ocean acidity decreases. This is a natural factor that has certainly kept liquid water on the Earth's surface for over 4 billion years. This theoretical approach does not take into account the influence of the organic carbon cycle. A significant proportion of this element is buried in organic form, making its dynamics much more complicated. A possible return of the ice ages is therefore not immediately foreseeable. In 50,000 years at the earliest. Do you think that by then mankind will have found ways to adapt to a new ice age?